Hello everyone and welcome back to Spook Speaks. I know many of you tune into these videos to help you to sleep, so I thought it would be a fun idea for everyone to share where you're listening from in the world. Feel free to drop a comment below, and if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get cozy and relaxed. Let's begin. Story 1. The forest always smelled like adventure. A mix of damp moss, pine needles, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. It was intoxicating, even after a long drive and an uphill hike. The idea of spending the weekend away from the chaos of work, phones, and endless noise sounded perfect. That's what we all needed. Quiet, untouched wilderness. It was Ben's idea to camp in Silver Hollow. Uncharted trails, he'd said with his usual enthusiasm, pulling up a grainy map on his phone. No people, just us and nature. The group had groaned, half joking about how uncharted could mean getting lost. But Ben was persuasive, and honestly, I was too exhausted to argue. Plus, the thought of not having to deal with emails for a few days sounded like heaven. The others were less thrilled. Mia, my best friend since college, kept grumbling about the lack of bathrooms. "I'm not digging a hole to pee," she said for the 5th time as we hiked up the narrow trail. "Relax," Ben shot back, adjusting the tent strap to his backpack. "You'll be fine. It's called roughing it." Josh, ever the peacekeeper, chuckled. "If you can survive finals week, Mia, you can survive a weekend with nature." She rolled her eyes but said nothing more. The hike was harder than I expected. The path grew steeper as we climbed, and the trees closed in overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. By the time we reached the clearing Ben had promised would be perfect for camping, my legs felt like jelly, but he was right. The spot was beautiful. A ring of towering pines encircled a small, grassy patch, and in the center was a fire pit made of smooth, stacked stones. A small creek trickled nearby, its sound soft and soothing. It was secluded, untouched, a postcard brought to life. "Worth it, right?" Ben said, dropping his pack with a triumphant grin. I had to admit it was. By dusk, we had the tents set up and a fire crackling in the pit. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows across the clearing as we passed around packets of marshmallows and chocolate. "So," Ben said, leaning back against a log, "campfire tradition. Who's got a good ghost story?" "Not it," Mia said immediately, stuffing a marshmallow onto her stick. Josh grinned. "What, you scared already?" "Of what?" "The trees." She smirked but glanced over her shoulder all the same. "I've got one," Ben said, his grin widening. "It's about these woods, actually." "Oh, here we go," Mia groaned, but we all leaned in anyway. Ben's voice dropped to a conspiratorial tone. "They say there's a watcher in these woods. No one's ever seen it, not clearly anyway. Just glimpses. A shadow between the trees, a flicker of movement when you're not looking. They say it doesn't like visitors." Josh laughed. "So it's what? A forest spirit? Bigfoot?" Ben shrugged. "Could be. Or maybe it's something worse. Something human." The fire crackled, and for a moment, the only sound was the creek. "Well, congratulations," Mia said, breaking the silence. "You've officially creeped me out." I laughed along with the others, but a strange feeling lingered, like the weight of Ben's words had settled over the group. By the time we crawled into our tents, the forest had fallen silent. The usual chirp of crickets and rustle of leaves were gone, leaving only the faint burble of the creek. Mia and I shared a tent, and as we zipped ourselves inside, she sighed. "I hate that stupid story. Now I'm going to hear every little sound and think it's the watcher." "Ben just likes to mess with people," I said, though I couldn't shake the unease that had taken root in my chest. Still, exhaustion won out and I drifted off to sleep. It must have been hours later when I woke up. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy, and the faint light of the dying fire filtered through the tent walls, casting long, trembling shadows. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the grass. At first, I thought it was one of the others, maybe heading to the creek. But the footsteps didn't move away. They circled the tent, slow and deliberate. "Mia," I whispered, nudging her awake. She groaned and turned over. "What?" "Someone's outside." Her eyes snapped open, and she froze, listening. The footsteps stopped. "Maybe it's Ben or Josh," she whispered, though her voice wavered. I wasn't so sure. I reached for the flashlight by my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died to embers, casting only faint light. The trees stood tall and still, their shadows stretching like claws across the clearing. And then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the fire pit, half hidden in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I ducked back into the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. "There's someone out there. What do we do?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Mia and I stayed frozen in the tent, barely daring to breathe. My hand gripped the flashlight like a lifeline, though I wasn't sure what good it would do if the figure outside decided to come closer. "Are they still there?" Mia finally whispered. "I don't know." My voice cracked, and I hated how small and powerless I felt. "I'll check again." Summoning what little courage I had, I leaned toward the tent's zipper and eased it down just enough to peek out. The figure was gone. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by a deeper unease. The clearing was empty, the dying embers of the fire barely illuminating the trunks of the towering pines. The air was still, almost suffocating. "I don't see them," I whispered, pulling the zipper back up. "Maybe it was one of the guys messing with us," Mia said, though her tone lacked conviction. I wanted to believe her, but something about the way that figure had stood there, so still, so silent, made my skin crawl. We didn't sleep much after that. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch sent our hearts racing. But eventually, the blackness outside began to soften, the first hints of dawn creeping through the trees. When we finally emerged from the tent, Ben and Josh were already by the fire pit, rekindling the flames. "Rough night?" Ben asked, noticing the bags under our eyes. "You could say that," Mia muttered, throwing him a pointed glare. Josh looked up from his task. "What happened?" "There was someone out there," I said, "by the fire, watching us." Ben frowned. "What do you mean, someone? Like a person?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It was dark." "But it wasn't one of you?" Josh shook his head. "I didn't leave the tent all night." "Neither did I," Ben added, his easygoing demeanor slipping. "Maybe it was an animal," Josh offered, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe it. "No," I said firmly. "It wasn't an animal. It was standing upright, just watching." The tension in the air was palpable. "All right, let's not freak out," Ben said, though he sounded more like he was trying to reassure himself. "We're in the middle of nowhere. Could have been a hiker or something. Let's just stay alert and stick together." That plan seemed solid until midday. We decided to hike further into the woods, hoping to explore a nearby ridge Ben had read about. The trail was overgrown, the trees thick and imposing. By the time we reached the ridge, we were drenched in sweat and more than a little on edge. It was there that we met her. An older woman, maybe in her 60s, stood at the edge of the ridge, staring out over the expanse of forest below. Her clothes were ragged, her hair tangled with twigs and leaves. She turned as we approached, her expression sharp and wary. "You shouldn't be here," she said before any of us could speak. Ben, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "We're just camping for the weekend. Didn't mean to intrude or anything." The woman shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "It's not about me. It's about them." A chill ran down my spine. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The Watchers," she said, her voice low and grave. "They don't like outsiders. They see everything, and once they've marked you, they don't let go." Mia let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, that's enough ghost stories for one trip." But the woman didn't smile. She just stared at us, her eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or pity. "You need to leave," she said again, "before it's too late." And with that, she turned and disappeared into the trees. The encounter left us shaken, though none of us wanted to admit it. "She's just some crazy local," Ben said as we made our way back to camp. "Probably trying to scare us off her turf or something." "Then why was she so serious?" I asked. Ben didn't answer. When we got back to the clearing, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, painting the forest in shades of orange and gold. But something was wrong. Our camp was trashed. The tents were slashed open, the contents strewn across the clearing. The fire pit had been completely dismantled, the stones scattered. Even the food we'd left in a sealed container was gone. "Bear," Josh said, though his voice wavered. "Bears don't cut tents," Mia said, pointing to the clean, precise slices in the fabric. For a moment, none of us spoke. "We need to go," I said finally. "Now." Ben hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's probably just some jerk messing with us. We can't let them scare us off." Mia turned on him. "Are you serious? Did you not see what that woman said? Or the fact that someone or something trashed our stuff? This isn't normal, Ben." He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, the sound of snapping branches echoed through the forest. We froze. The noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from all directions. Then, from the shadows of the trees, the glinting lights appeared again, dozens of them, flickering between the trunks like fireflies. But they weren't fireflies, and they were moving straight toward us. We didn't speak. No one needed to say anything. We all felt it, the crushing weight of dread as the flickering lights crept closer. Mia was the first to move, grabbing my arm. "We need to go. Now." Ben hesitated, still trying to rationalize the situation. "It's probably just..." "Don't finish that sentence," Mia snapped, her voice sharp with panic. "We're leaving." The lights were growing brighter, weaving through the trees like they had a mind of their own. One moment they were distant, and the next they were just beyond the clearing. Whatever they were, they weren't natural. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing my pack and bolting toward the trail. The others followed, our footsteps pounding against the forest floor. Branches snagged at my clothes, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Behind us, the lights followed, gliding through the trees like silent predators. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear them, low, whispering voices, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "What the hell are those?" Josh yelled, his voice breaking. "Does it matter?" Mia shot back, her breath ragged. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they might give out. The trail twisted and turned, the trees pressing in on all sides. The forest felt endless, an inescapable maze of shadows and whispers. Then, without warning, Ben stopped. "Wait!" he gasped, doubling over to catch his breath. "We can't keep running blind. We'll get lost." "We're already lost," Mia cried, her voice shrill. "No," Ben said, straightening up. "The creek. If we follow the creek..." It'll lead us back to the main trail. He was right. The creek wasn't far from our camp, and it ran parallel to the main trail for several miles. It was our best shot. Okay, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. Let's find the creek. We stumbled through the forest, our breaths loud in the suffocating silence. The lights had fallen back, but I knew they were still there, watching us from the shadows. When we finally found the creek, relief washed over me. The water shimmered faintly in the moonlight, its gentle babble a strange comfort in the oppressive stillness. This way, Ben said, taking the lead. The creek was shallow, but the rocks were slippery, and every step felt precarious. The cold water soaked through my boots, chilling me to the bone. Keep moving, Mia urged, glancing over her shoulder. I didn't need to look to know what she was afraid of. The lights were back, flickering along the edges of the trees, their movements unervingly deliberate. They're closer, Josh whispered. Don't stop, Ben said, his voice tight. We followed the creek for what felt like hours, the lights trailing us like a pack of wolves. The whispers were louder now, almost intelligible, but every time I strained to hear, they slipped away like smoke. Then, without warning, the ground gave out beneath me. One moment I was walking, and the next, I was sliding down a steep embankment, the world spinning around me. I hit the water hard, the icy shock stealing my breath. Help! I gasped, clawing at the rocks. Mia and Josh scrambled down after me, their faces pale with panic. Ben was already at my side, pulling me up. Are you okay? He asked. I nodded, coughing up water. Yeah, I think so. But as I stood, I realized something was wrong. The whispers were gone, and the forest was deathly silent. Too silent. They stopped, Mia said, her voice trembling. Josh scanned the trees, his eyes wide. Where are they? Before anyone could answer, a sharp crack split the air, followed by a deep, guttural growl. It wasn't coming from the lights. The growl echoed through the trees, low and menacing, felt alive, reverberating in my chest like a warning. Move, Ben barked, shoving us forward. We stumbled along the creek, the growl following us like a shadow. Whatever was making that sound, it was massive and getting closer. Ben, what is that? Mia cried, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, he shouted. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of snapping branches. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it, the weight of something enormous bearing down on us. We broke into a clearing, the moonlight illuminating a wide expanse of moss-covered ground. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then I saw it. It stood at the edge of the trees, its form half hidden in shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Its eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the flickers in the forest, but there was no mistaking the malice in its gaze. Oh my God, Mia whispered. The creature stepped forward, its movements unervingly fluid. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and the growl that emerged was enough to freeze me in place. Run, Ben said, his voice barely audible. But there was nowhere to run. There was no time to think, only act. The creature stepped into the clearing, its towering form blocking our only path back to the creek. Its glowing eyes bore into us, radiating a hunger that felt ancient and unrelenting. We can't outrun it, Ben said, his voice tight with fear. We can't fight it either, Mia cried, gripping my arm. The whispers returned, weaving through the clearing like a chilling wind. The lights from before began to reappear, circling the edges of the trees. They moved faster now, as if excited by the creature's arrival. What do we do? Josh asked, his voice trembling. I looked around desperately, my mind racing. The creature was advancing, its long limbs cutting through the space between us with terrifying ease. Then my eyes fell on the flare gun in Ben's backpack. "The flare!" I shouted. "Ben, get the flare!" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then dropped his pack and yanked the flare gun from one of the side pockets. His hands shook as he loaded it, the small metallic click echoing louder than it should have. "Now!" I screamed. Ben raised the gun and fired. The flare shot through the air, a blazing streak of red that illuminated the clearing in harsh, flickering light. It struck the creature in the chest, and for a moment it seemed to falter. Its guttural growl turned into a roar of pain, and the glowing lights around the clearing flared brighter, almost blinding. "Run!" Ben yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. We didn't need to be told twice. We tore through the forest, the trail a blur beneath our feet. Behind us, the creature roared again, and the earth seemed to shudder with its fury. The lights followed, darting between the trees like malevolent fireflies. Branches tore at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The only thought in my mind was escape. The creek reappeared ahead, its shimmering surface a beacon in the darkness. "Follow the water," I shouted, not sure if the others could hear me over the pounding of my heart. We splashed into the creek, the icy water shocking my senses. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the lights were trying to stop us. Then the creature roared again, closer this time. I risked a glance back and saw it crashing through the trees, its long limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. "We're not going to make it," Mia screamed, her voice raw with panic. "Yes, we are," I shouted, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The forest began to thin, the trees giving way to open space. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they might explode, but I pushed forward. Then, finally, we broke free. The trailhead appeared before us, the parking lot just beyond. The sight of our car, still parked and waiting, was almost too much to process. "We made it!" Josh cried, his voice breaking with relief. But the creature wasn't done. It burst from the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on us. Its roar shattered the morning stillness, a sound so primal it seemed to shake the earth itself. Ben turned, the empty flare gun still in his hand. "Go! Get to the car!" "No!" I screamed, grabbing his arm. "We all go!" He didn't argue. Together, we sprinted to the car, throwing ourselves inside as the creature closed the distance. Josh fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. "Come on! Come on!" The engine roared to life just as the creature reached us. Its massive limbs slammed against the side of the car, rocking it violently. "Drive!" Mia screamed. Josh floored it, the tires screeching as we sped out of the lot. The creature gave chase, its glowing eyes the last thing I saw before we turned onto the main road and left the forest behind. We didn't stop driving until we reached the safety of the nearest town. No one at the local diner believed our story, of course. They chalked it up to overactive imaginations and too much time in the woods. But the older waitress who brought us coffee leaned in close and whispered, "You were lucky. Not everyone gets away from Silver Hollow." Her words stayed with me long after we left. We never returned to those woods. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I hear it, that low, guttural growl, and the whispers that followed us that night. And I know the Watcher is still out there, waiting for its next visitors. And if you're still watching, hit the subscribe button and keep supporting the channel. Story 2. I never thought I'd find myself camping in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest and an unyielding darkness. But there we were, 5 friends, a crackling fire, and a plan to escape the monotony of our daily lives. The idea was Ben's, of course. He was always the adventurous one, the type who sought out thrill and danger like it was a game. "Come on, guys," he had said with that stupidly charming grin of his. "This place is perfect, totally secluded, and the views are insane." Now, sitting around the campfire, I wasn't so sure about his choice. The woods pressed in on us, their shadows twisting and shifting with the movement of the flames. "It's too quiet out here," Mia muttered, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "That's the point," Ben replied, leaning back against a log. "No city noise, no traffic, just us and nature. And whatever else is out there," Josh added with a smirk. "Stop," Mia snapped. "This place already gives me the creeps. You don't need to make it worse." Josh shrugged, unbothered. "I'm just saying it's prime ghost story territory. A spooky forest, a campfire, no cell service. What could go wrong?" "Nothing's going to go wrong," Sarah said, her voice firm. She was always the calm one, the voice of reason in our group. "It's just a weekend trip. Let's enjoy it." I wanted to believe her, but something about this place felt off. The firelight didn't seem to reach as far as it should have, and the darkness beyond the trees felt heavier, more alive. "All right," Ben said, clapping his hands together. "Who's up for a story?" "Oh no," Mia groaned. "Please don't." "Come on," Ben teased. "It's tradition. You can't have a campfire without a scary story." "Fine," Josh said, leaning forward with a grin. "But it better be good." Ben's smile widened. "Oh, it's good. It's called the Phantom Campfire." Ben leaned forward, his face lit eerily by the flickering flames. He took his time, letting the silence settle over us, building the tension with every passing second. "They say," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "that deep in these woods, there's a campsite that no one can ever find on purpose. A campfire that burns even when there's no one around to light it." "Sounds like a ghost story already," Josh said, though his voice lacked its usual sarcasm. Ben ignored him, continuing. "The Phantom Campfire only appears to those who've lost their way. When the fire finds you, it promises warmth, safety, and maybe even a way out of the forest. But it's a lie, because the moment you sit by that fire—" He paused, his gaze sweeping over us. "You're never seen again." Mia groaned. "Seriously? That's the best you've got? A magical, disappearing campfire?" Ben grinned, undeterred. "It's not just the fire. They say you can hear it first, voices whispering in the woods, calling you closer. And if you ignore them, they get louder. They follow you, no matter where you go, until you have no choice but to sit down and join them." "That's stupid," Mia said, though she couldn't hide the way her eyes darted nervously toward the trees. "I don't know," Josh said, leaning back and crossing his arms. "It's not bad. Creepy woods, mysterious voices, eternal damnation. It checks all the boxes." Sarah rolled her eyes. "It's a story, Mia. Relax." Ben raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just telling you what I heard, but you don't have to believe me, unless—" His grin turned mischievous. "You start hearing voices tonight." The fire burned low as the night deepened, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. After Ben's story, the mood had shifted. The easy laughter and teasing gave way to a quiet unease, each of us lost in our own thoughts. "I'm going to bed," Sarah said finally, standing and brushing the dirt from her jeans. "We have a long hike tomorrow." One by one, the others followed, retreating to their tents. But I stayed by the fire, staring into the dying embers. Something about Ben's story had stuck with me, an itch at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. The forest felt alive, the trees looming closer in the dim light. I told myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining things. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a distant murmur. I tilted my head, straining to hear. "Help me!" I froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable, a desperate, pleading whisper coming from the trees. "Hello!" I called, my voice shaking. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Please, don't leave." My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the fire. "Who's there?" The forest was silent again, the only sound the crackle of the dying fire. I glanced toward the tents, tempted to wake the others, but something stopped me. The whisper returned, louder now. "Join us," came from all around me, echoing through the trees. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my tent, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I threw myself inside, zipping the flap shut and collapsing onto my sleeping bag. "You okay?" Mia's voice startled me. She was sitting up, her face pale in the dim light of her flashlight. "Yeah," I lied. "Just thought I heard something." Her eyes widened. "Like what?" I hesitated. "I don't know. Probably just the wind." But Mia didn't look convinced. She lay back down, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "This place is creepy," she muttered. I didn't answer, my mind racing. The whisper had felt real, too real. But I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Not yet. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the trees, set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking about Ben's story, about the voices that lured people to the phantom campfire. Somehow, I drifted off, my dreams filled with flickering flames and shadowy figures. Morning came as a welcome relief, the sunlight piercing through the trees and driving away the oppressive darkness of the night. I was the first to crawl out of my tent, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, but the sight of the morning sky above reminded me of normalcy. Maybe it had all been a dream. "Rough night." Ben's voice startled me. He was sitting on a nearby log, munching on an energy bar. I shrugged. "Just the usual forest noises, I guess." He raised an eyebrow, but before he could press further, the others began to emerge from their tents. "Everyone ready for the hike?" Ben asked, his tone far too chipper. Mia groaned. "I didn't sleep at all. Something about this place doesn't feel right." "You're just freaked out because of the story," Josh teased, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "I'm serious," Mia shot back. I kept hearing things. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I kept quiet. "All right, let's pack up and move," Sarah said, stepping in to defuse the tension. "The next site is only a couple of miles away. Maybe it'll feel better there." We broke camp quickly, eager to leave the clearing behind. As we started down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hike was grueling, the uneven terrain forcing us to focus on each step. The dense forest seemed to close in around us, the canopy above blocking out much of the sunlight. "Does anyone else feel like this trail is longer than it should be?" Mia asked, her voice wavering. "It's just because we're tired," Sarah replied, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "Or maybe we're going in circles," Josh muttered. "Stop it," Ben snapped. "We're on the right path. Let's keep moving." But the unease was spreading. Even Ben, usually so confident, kept glancing over his shoulder. Then we saw it, the campsite. At first, it seemed like a blessing. A clearing with a perfect fire pit and enough space for our tents. But something was off. "It's too neat," Sarah said, frowning. "Like someone set it up and left." The fire pit was filled with unburned wood, as if someone had prepared it but never lit it. Maybe another group was here and packed up early? Ben offered, but even he didn't sound convinced. I don't like this, Mia whispered. It's like it's waiting for us. We set up camp reluctantly, the tension palpable. No one wanted to admit it, but we all felt it, that invisible weight pressing down on us. As night fell, Ben tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and handing out snacks. But when we gathered around the fire pit, none of us could bring ourselves to light it. Fine, Josh said, grabbing a lighter. If no one else will. A sudden flare of light cut him off. The fire roared to life, bright and unnatural, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. None of us had touched it. What the hell? Sarah gasped, stumbling back. It's not possible, Mia whispered, her face pale. Ben stepped closer, his expression unreadable. It's just, maybe someone left a match in there or... Stop trying to explain it, I snapped. We all saw it. That fire lit itself. The whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. Join us. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the clearing like a sinister lullaby. Mia clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. We need to leave. Now. We can't, Ben said, though his voice wavered. It's too dark to navigate the trail. Then we put the fire out, Josh said, grabbing a water bottle. But as he stepped toward the flames, the fire flared, its heat forcing him back. Okay, that's not normal, he muttered, his bravado faltering. The whispers grew more insistent. Sit with us, stay. The forest around us seemed to shift, the trees leaning closer as if drawn to the firelight. Shadows danced in the periphery, their movements unnatural. We're not alone, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I turned to her, confused. What do you mean? She pointed toward the edge of the clearing, where faint figures stood just beyond the light. Do you see them? The figures were barely visible, their forms shimmering like heat waves. They stood motionless, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Who are they? Mia stammered, her voice breaking. No one, Ben said quickly, though he refused to look at them. There's no one there. Stop lying, I snapped, fear making my voice louder than I intended. We all see them. The figures stepped closer, their movements unnervingly smooth. The fire flared again, as if welcoming them. Sit, stay forever. The whispers were deafening now, wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. Run, I shouted, grabbing Mia's hand and bolting toward the trail. The others followed, their footsteps pounding behind me. The fire blazed brighter, its light chasing us into the darkness. Our frantic footsteps pounded against the forest floor, the uneven terrain nearly sending me sprawling as we bolted from the cursed campsite. Mia's hand was slippery with sweat in mine, but I refused to let go. The whispers chased us, a cacophony of voices growing louder with every step. Don't look back, I shouted, though the temptation gnawed at me. Where are we even going? Josh yelled, panic thick in his voice. We're just running blind. We can't stop. Ben shouted from behind us. Just keep moving. The forest seemed alive, the trees shifting as if to funnel us back toward the campsite. Every direction felt the same, endless darkness and the oppressive weight of the whispers. Left, Sarah shouted, veering toward what looked like an opening in the trees. We followed, crashing through the underbrush. My lungs burned, and every muscle in my body screamed for rest, but the fear of what was behind us kept me moving. Finally, the whispers began to fade, replaced by the pounding of blood in my ears. We stumbled into a small clearing, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. What was that? Mia gasped, clutching her chest. Not normal, Josh muttered, his eyes darting around the clearing. None of this is normal. We sat in silence, the weight of what we'd just experienced sinking in. No one dared to speak of the figures or the fire that had lit itself. It doesn't make sense, Ben said finally, breaking the silence. We've been hiking all day. The campsite shouldn't be anywhere near here. Maybe we took a wrong turn, Sarah suggested weakly, though even she didn't sound convinced. Wrong turn or not, we're stuck, I said, my voice shaking. That thing is out there, and it's not going to stop. Then we keep moving, Ben said, standing and brushing dirt off his pants. We find the main trail and get the hell out of here. No, Mia's voice was firm, her eyes wide with fear. It doesn't matter where we go. That thing, those whispers, they'll follow us. Then what do you suggest? Ben snapped, his frustration bubbling over. We wait, she said, at least until sunrise. Whatever's out there. Maybe it can't follow us in the daylight. The hours crawled by as we huddled together in the clearing, too afraid to sleep. The firelight from the phantom campsite seemed burned into my vision, flickering in the darkness every time I closed my eyes. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just an oppressive stillness. Then, as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, the tension began to lift. The whispers were gone, and the forest seemed to breathe again. See, Ben said, his voice tinged with relief. It's over. But as we packed our bags and prepared to leave the clearing, something caught my eye, a faint, smoky glow in the distance. The phantom campfire. No way, Josh breathed, staring in the same direction. We ran for miles. How is it still here? It's not here, I said, my voice hollow. It's everywhere. Determined to escape, we pressed forward, following what we hoped was the trail back to the parking lot. But the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more the forest seemed to twist and change. I swear we've passed that tree already, Mia muttered, her voice trembling. You're imagining things, Ben said, though his confidence had faded. No, she's not, Sarah said, pointing at a broken branch on the ground. We've definitely been here before. It wasn't just the forest that felt off. The light was wrong, dim and hazy, as if the sun was struggling to reach us. And then the whispers returned. Don't leave, stay. Keep going, I shouted, pushing through the underbrush. But the forest wouldn't let us leave. Every path we took led us back to the same place. The phantom campfire, now burning brighter than before. The fire seemed to beckon us, its flames licking higher as we approached. The figures were back, more distinct now. Their forms were translucent, their faces etched with sorrow. It's them, Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The ones who stayed. We're not staying, Ben said through gritted teeth, grabbing a stick and hurling it into the fire. The flames didn't waver. If anything, they grew stronger, casting long, menacing shadows across the clearing. Join us. The voices were louder now, almost deafening. The figures stepped closer, their hollow eyes fixed on us. We have to end this, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The fire is the key. We have to put it out. How? Josh asked, his voice shaking. It's not normal fire. Just try, Sarah shouted. We scrambled to gather dirt and water, throwing it onto the flames with frantic desperation. The fire hissed and sputtered, but it refused to die. Then Mia screamed. The figures were closing in, their translucent hands reaching for her. The figures moved closer, their faces twisted in silent agony. I could feel their cold presence, like a chill in the air that crept under my skin, freezing me to the spot. Mia struggled against the ghostly figures, but their hands gripped her arms with a strength that didn't belong to anything human. "Help her!" Josh screamed, but he was rooted to the ground, fear making his voice catch in his throat. I felt the pull of the fire. It beckoned like a hypnotic force, a promise of warmth that was both comforting and terrifying. The flames flickered and danced, casting shadows that seemed to stretch impossibly long, clawing at the edges of the clearing. "You can't leave," a whisper came, and for a moment, I could have sworn it was my own voice, but it wasn't. The words were twisted, distorted, a combination of many voices layered over one another. "Stop!" Sarah shouted, finally breaking out of her stupor. She grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it into the fire, but the flames flared up, almost as if they were taunting her. The figures surrounding Mia began to pull her closer to the fire. Her screams echoed through the clearing, sharp and desperate. "No!" I ran forward without thinking, grabbing Mia's arm and trying to pull her away, but her body felt like ice. She was slipping from my grasp, as though something deeper, something ancient, was pulling her in. "Help!" Mia cried, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, don't let them take me. Hold on!" I shouted, tugging harder, but the figures were relentless, their fingers tightening around her. The fire was alive, almost sentient, and it was hungry. It wanted her. It wanted all of us. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. "Don't listen to them," Sarah cried, pulling me back. "We have to stop fighting the fire. It wants us to give in. It doesn't let go unless we give in to it." I turned to her, confused. "What do you mean? How do we stop it?" But Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my hand and forced me to look at the fire. I could see the images now. Faces in the flames, all of them twisted in agony. The fire wasn't just a flame. It was a memory, a trap. "The only way out," Sarah said, her voice shaking, "is to join them." I stared at her in disbelief. "What? You can't be serious." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the flames. "There's no escape unless we give in. We fight it and we'll end up like them, lost forever." I shook my head, trying to push the words away, but I couldn't deny the truth in her voice. The figures around Mia were pulling her closer, her body beginning to fade into their ghostly form. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice broken, "what do we do? The fire will let us go if we just surrender. Let it take us in and we can be free." I wanted to scream, to argue, but Mia's voice cut through my thoughts. "Please help me. Don't let them take me." I looked back at the fire, my heart racing. The flames beckoned. It was an undeniable urge, a temptation I couldn't ignore. It was like the fire knew me, like it was calling me home. I looked at Ben and Josh, their faces as pale as ghosts, their eyes wide with fear. There was no time left to think. "Hold on, Mia," I shouted. "We'll figure this out." But it was already too late. The figures dragged Mia closer to the fire. Her screams were swallowed by the flames, her body flickering and dissolving into nothingness. She was gone. The fire roared louder, its crackling deafening as it reached for the rest of us. The figures now turned to us, their hollow eyes filled with a strange, mournful desire. "No!" Ben shouted, backing away, his eyes wild. "This can't be happening." I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to run, to escape. But the fire was everywhere now, pulling at us, tugging at our hearts. The forest around us seemed to melt into the heat of the flames. "Sarah," cried, my voice shaking. What do we do? Her eyes were glassy, her face empty of emotion. We give in, she said quietly, her words barely a whisper. The fire won't stop until we do. I stood there paralyzed. The warmth of the fire seemed to wrap around me, comforting and cold at once. I could feel the pull of it, the promise of peace, of release from everything. Please, Mia's voice echoed from the flames. Join me. It was no longer Mia. It was the fire speaking through her. The same voices, the same whispers. Join us. I stepped forward, my body moving of its own accord. The fire called to me, and for the first time, it didn't seem so frightening. It seemed right. I felt my feet moving, the heat drawing me in, the darkness at the edges of my vision. But just as my hand reached out to touch the flames, something yanked me back. It was Ben. No, he shouted, pulling me away. You can't. You can't give in to it. But I was dizzy, my thoughts blurred, the fire still calling to me. Ben, please, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It wants us. I feel it. I just want to end it. Fight it. Ben's voice broke. You can't give up. I shook my head, unable to focus. The figures were closing in around us again, their hands reaching for us. The fire's voice grew louder, its whispers now a torrent. And then, suddenly, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, the fire was gone. The clearing was silent, empty. The figures were no longer there. Mia too was gone. I didn't know how much time had passed. Everything felt still. The forest around me was untouched by the events that had transpired. Ben, I whispered, my voice shaky. A rustling sound to my right made me spin around. Ben stepped out from the shadows, his face pale, his eyes wide. It's over, he said quietly, his voice distant. We're free. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest wasn't the same. It was quieter, but there was an undercurrent of something wrong, something waiting. And I knew, deep down, that the phantom campfire had never truly been extinguished. It had only moved, waiting for its next victim. And we had become a part of its story. Story 3. I always found lakes unsettling. Not because of their beauty or serenity, those were undeniable. No, it was the silence, the kind of quiet that felt alive, like the water itself was holding its breath, waiting. So when my sister Leah invited me to spend a weekend with her and her friends at Silent Lake, I should have trusted my instincts and said no. Come on, Ryan, she had pleaded, her voice bubbling with excitement. You've been cooped up in your apartment for months. A little fresh air and some good company will do you good. Reluctantly, I agreed, packing light and promising myself I'd make it through the weekend without succumbing to my usual paranoia. The drive to Silent Lake was uneventful, long stretches of highway giving way to narrow, winding roads lined with towering pines. Leah kept the conversation flowing, her chatter filling the car as I navigated the curves. This place is incredible, she said, scrolling through pictures on her phone. Clear water, a cozy cabin, and absolutely no cell service. Perfect for unwinding. No cell service? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Relax, she teased. It's just a couple of days. You might even enjoy being disconnected. When we arrived, the lake lived up to its name. A vast expanse of water stretched out before us, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the setting sun. The surrounding forest was dense and dark, the kind of place that swallowed sound and light. Leah's friends, Mark, Samantha, and Jake, were already at the cabin, unpacking groceries and cracking open beers. They greeted us warmly, their easy camaraderie helping me push aside my unease. "Ryan," Mark clapped me on the back. "Glad you could join us. You're gonna love it here." "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Looks peaceful." That first evening was almost idyllic. We cooked dinner over an open fire, shared stories, and laughed under a sky full of stars. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, beautiful and eerily still. But even as I laughed along with the group, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That first night, I barely slept. The cabin was cozy enough, its rustic charm accentuated by the faint smell of cedar and a soft creak in the floorboards. My bed was positioned near a window overlooking the lake, and as I lay there, staring into the darkness, the silence pressed in around me. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of being far from civilization. This was something else entirely, dense, weighty, like the world was holding its breath. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I awoke to the sound of water lapping against the shore. It was faint, rhythmic, but it felt off, like it didn't belong in the unnatural stillness of Silent Lake. I got out of bed, careful not to wake Leah in the room next to mine, and approached the window. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, its surface unmarred by wind or movement. But something caught my eye, a ripple in the center of the water, small but deliberate. I leaned closer, squinting. There were no boats, no wildlife, nothing that could have caused it. Yet the ripple expanded outward, slow and deliberate, until it disappeared into the stillness. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It was probably just a fish, I told myself, shaking off the unease. But as I turned back to the bed, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow, just at the edge of the lake, standing motionless. I froze. "Ryan!" Leah's voice startled me, cutting through the silence. I spun around to find her standing in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the dim glow of the hallway light. "Why are you up?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. "I thought I heard something," I said, turning back to the window. The shadow was gone. The lake was still again. "Probably just the water," she said, yawning. "Come on, get some sleep. You're overthinking it." She left before I could respond, and I climbed back into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Somewhere outside, the lake whispered secrets I wasn't meant to hear. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's windows, warming the wood-paneled walls and casting long beams of light across the floor. For a brief moment, I convinced myself that the night before had been a figment of my imagination, a trick of my tired mind. Leah and her friends were already up when I emerged from my room. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and laughter echoed from the kitchen. "Look who finally decided to join us," Mark teased, holding out a mug of coffee. "Rough night." I forced a chuckle. "Just not used to how quiet it is out here." "You'll get used to it," Samantha said, flipping pancakes on the griddle. "By the end of the weekend, you won't want to leave." Jake leaned against the counter, smirking. "Unless the Silent Lake ghost gets you first." "Jake," Leah groaned, rolling her eyes. "Don't start." "What ghost?" I asked, my interest piqued despite myself. "Oh, it's just a dumb local legend," Leah said, waving a hand dismissively. "Every lake has one, right?" No, Jake said, grinning. "This one's legit. They say the lake's haunted by a woman who drowned here decades ago. Supposedly, she's still searching for someone, or something, beneath the surface." "Let me guess," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "She drags unsuspecting swimmers to their doom?" "Exactly," Jake said, clearly enjoying himself. "And some nights, if it's quiet enough, you can hear her calling out, looking for her next victim." "Knock it off, Jake," Leah said, shaking her head. Ryan's already jumpy enough as it is. I'm not jumpy, I said quickly, though the memory of the shadow by the lake lingered in my mind. Well, you can test the legend yourself, Samantha said, setting a plate of pancakes on the table. We're planning a swim after breakfast. I hesitated, glancing out the window at the lake. It sparkled under the morning sun, serene and inviting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it. The water was colder than I expected, sending a shock through my system as I waded in. Leah and the others splashed and laughed, their carefree energy contagious. For a while, I let myself relax, floating on my back and staring up at the clear blue sky. But then I felt it, a faint tug at my foot. I jerked upright, my heart racing. Did one of you just grab me? I called out, scanning the water around me. Nope, Leah shouted back, grinning. Probably just some seaweed. Relax, Ryan. But the lake was too still, too empty for it to be seaweed. I swam closer to the shore, the uneasy feeling from the night before creeping back. As I stepped onto the sand, something caught my eye. A small, shiny object half buried at the water's edge. I crouched down, brushing away the sand to reveal what looked like a locket. It was old, tarnished silver with an intricate design etched onto its surface. Carefully, I pried it open. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman with hauntingly familiar features. Hey, what's that? Leah asked, walking over to me. I found it in the water, I said, holding it up. She frowned, studying the locket. Weird. Maybe someone lost it a long time ago. Or maybe it belonged to her, Jake said, appearing beside us with a mischievous grin. The ghost. I shot him a glare, but Leah nudged me playfully. Don't let him get to you. It's probably nothing. But as I slipped the locket into my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't nothing. That night, the lake's silence returned, heavier than before. The locket sat on the nightstand beside me, its presence feeling almost accusatory. And then I heard it, a faint, melodic hum coming from the direction of the water. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The hum grew louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, carrying a tune that sent chills down my spine. I crept to the window and peered out. The lake was calm, bathed in moonlight, but in the distance I saw her. A figure standing at the water's edge, her outline blurred but unmistakably human. She turned slowly, as if sensing my gaze, and though her face was hidden by shadows, I felt her eyes lock onto mine. I stumbled back from the window, my breath hitching. When I looked again, she was gone, but the humming continued, growing louder, beckoning me toward the silent, waiting lake. I barely slept that night. The humming had stopped abruptly, leaving me in a silence so oppressive it felt as though the lake itself was holding its breath. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the trees outside made me jump, and when morning finally broke, it felt like a reprieve from a nightmare. But the locket weighed heavily in my pocket, as if tethering me to the events of the night before. At breakfast, I couldn't hide my unease. Leah noticed immediately. You look like you saw a ghost, she joked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Funny? I muttered, pushing my eggs around on my plate. Seriously, what's up? She pressed, her tone softening. You've been on edge since we got here. I debated whether to tell her about the humming, the figure by the lake, but I knew how it would sound. Instead, I pulled the locket from my pocket and placed it on the table. This, I said, watching her reaction carefully. She picked it up, examining it again. You're still hung up on this? Ryan, it's just an old trinket. Probably washed up here ages ago. Then why was there someone by the lake last night? I blurted before I could stop myself. The room went quiet. Mark, Jake, and Samantha looked up from their plates, the mood shifting instantly. "What do you mean, someone by the lake?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing. "I saw something," I said hesitantly. "A figure, a woman. She was standing at the edge of the water and—" "You're kidding, right?" Jake interrupted, grinning. "Come on, man. You're falling for the ghost story." "I'm not joking," I snapped, my frustration bubbling over. "She was there, and she looked at me." Leah sighed, placing a hand on my arm. "Ryan, it's probably just your imagination. You said yourself you didn't sleep well. The lake can play tricks on you." "Or," Jake chimed in, smirking, "maybe it was her." "Enough, Jake," Samantha said sharply. Jake shrugged, clearly unbothered, but I noticed a flicker of unease in his expression. "Look," Leah said, squeezing my arm. "Why don't we take a hike today? Clear our heads, get away from the water for a bit." I nodded reluctantly, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake wasn't done with me. The hike took us deep into the forest, where the dense canopy of trees blocked out much of the sunlight. Leah led the way, her usual chatter helping to lighten the mood. But as we ventured farther, I noticed something unsettling. The silence. It wasn't just the absence of human sounds. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of insects. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as though it shared the lake's eerie stillness. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Samantha asked, her voice low. Mark chuckled nervously. "Don't start, Sam. It's just a quiet forest." But I could tell she wasn't joking. Her eyes darted around the trees, her grip tightening on the water bottle she carried. "I think we should head back," Leah said suddenly, her cheerful tone faltering. No one argued. The walk back felt longer, the forest closing in around us. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. But the lake wasn't calm anymore. Small ripples spread across its surface, originating from the center. They moved outward in perfect circles, too uniform to be natural. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, stepping closer to the water. "Don't," I said sharply, grabbing his arm. He shook me off, his bravado faltering as he stared at the ripples. "It's just wind or something." "There's no wind," Leah whispered, her voice trembling. We stood there, frozen, as the ripples grew larger, faster. And then, without warning, a single pale hand broke the surface of the water. Samantha screamed, and Jake stumbled backward, nearly falling. The hand hovered there for a moment, water dripping from its skeletal fingers, before sinking back beneath the surface. The lake stilled instantly, as if nothing had happened. "Tell me you saw that," I said, my voice shaking. No one answered. That night, none of us could sleep. We sat in the living room, the locket placed on the coffee table between us like an accusation. "It's connected to her," I said, breaking the tense silence. "The woman in the lake. She wants this back." "That's insane," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Samantha shot back, her usual calm replaced with fear. "Did you see that hand? What else could it be?" Leah rubbed her temples, looking exhausted. "Let's just figure this out. There has to be a reason this is happening. Maybe the locket is important." "Great," Jake said sarcastically. "Let's just toss it back in the lake and call it a day." "No," I said firmly. "If we give it back without knowing what it means, we could make things worse." "Worse than ghost hands grabbing us?" Jake snapped. Leah held up her hands. "Stop. Everyone just stop. Tomorrow we'll head into town and ask around." Someone has to know something about the lake's history. I nodded, though I doubted anyone in town would have answers. Deep down, I knew the lake wouldn't let us go until it got what it wanted. And whatever that was, it terrified me. The next morning, we piled into Mark's car and made the winding drive into the nearby town. It was a quaint place, the kind of small, sleepy settlement where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As we walked down the main street, the curious eyes of locals followed us, their whispers barely concealed. It was Samantha who finally broke the ice, approaching an older man sitting on a bench outside a general store. His face was weathered, his hands calloused, but his eyes were sharp as he regarded her with suspicion. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "We're staying at the cabin by Silent Lake. We were hoping you might know something about its history." The man's expression darkened instantly. "That lake's cursed," he said, his voice gravelly. "Cursed?" Leah asked, stepping closer. He nodded. "Been that way for decades. Folks around here avoid it, smart folks anyway. You'd do well to pack up and leave." "We can't," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "Something happened. We need to know why." The man studied me for a long moment before sighing. "You're not the first to come looking for answers. Doubt you'll like what you find, though." "Try us," Jake said, though his bravado had clearly diminished. The man gestured to the bench beside him. "Sit. I'll tell you what I know." The story he told was chilling. Decades ago, the lake had been the site of a tragedy. A young woman named Evelyn had disappeared while rowing across its waters. Her boat was found drifting near the center of the lake, but there was no sign of her. "They searched for weeks," the man said, his voice heavy with the weight of the tale. "Diverse dogs, you name it, but they never found her body." "Do they know what happened?" Leah asked. He shook his head. "Some say it was an accident. Others think it was murder. But there are those who believe the lake took her." "The lake," I echoed, a chill running down my spine. He nodded solemnly. "There's something unnatural about that place. Folks around here have seen things, heard things. They say Evelyn's spirit never left. She's still searching, calling out for someone to help her." "Help her with what?" Samantha asked. The man shrugged. "No one knows. But if she's taken an interest in you, it's best not to ignore her." "What about this?" I asked, pulling the locket from my pocket. His eyes widened as he leaned in to examine it. "Where did you find this?" "In the lake," I said. "Does it mean something?" "It's hers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's Evelyn's locket." The drive back to the cabin was heavy with silence. No one spoke, each of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the lake seemed to greet us with its usual stillness, the water as smooth as glass. But it no longer felt serene, felt watchful. "We have to return it," Samantha said finally, breaking the silence. "I don't think it's that simple," I said, staring at the locket in my hand. "What do you mean?" Leah asked. "She doesn't just want it back. She wants something else. Closure, maybe." "Closure," Jake snorted. "What are we supposed to do, hold a seance?" "Enough," Leah snapped, her voice sharp. "This isn't a joke, Jake. If we don't do something, who knows what might happen?" For once, Jake didn't argue. That night, I sat alone on the cabin's porch, the locket resting on the table beside me. The others had gone to bed, their nerves frayed from the day's events. But I couldn't sleep, not with the weight of Evelyn's story pressing down on me. The lake was eerily calm, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. As I stared at it, the humming began again, soft and mournful. I rose from my chair, the locket clutched tightly in my hand, and stepped toward the water. "Evelyn," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If you're here, show me." For a moment, nothing happened. The lake remained still, the night silent. But then the water began to ripple. A figure emerged from the center of the lake, her form translucent and shimmering in the moonlight. She was beautiful, her long hair flowing around her like a dark halo, but her eyes were filled with sorrow, and her lips moved as if she were speaking, though no sound came out. I held up the locket. "Is this what you want?" She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. I took a deep breath, stepping into the water until it lapped around my ankles. The cold seeped into my skin, but I didn't stop. I held out the locket, and she reached for it, her hand brushing against mine. A surge of icy energy shot through me, and I gasped as images flooded my mind. Evelyn rowing across the lake, a struggle, a shadowy figure pushing her into the water. Her terror, her desperation, and finally, her silence as the lake claimed her. When the vision ended, I was back on the shore, the locket gone and the lake still once more. I collapsed to my knees, trembling, as Leah and the others rushed out of the cabin. "Ryan, what happened?" Leah asked, kneeling beside me. "She showed me," I said, my voice shaking. "She showed me everything." I could barely speak as I recounted what Evelyn had shown me. The vision was vivid and haunting, like I had lived her final moments myself. Every detail was seared into my memory. The boat rocking violently, her cries for help, and the shadowed figure standing over her, their face obscured by the moonlight. "She didn't just drown," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Someone killed her." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. "You're saying it was murder?" Leah asked, her tone disbelieving but laced with fear. I nodded. "She was pushed into the lake. The locket wasn't just hers, it was taken from her. It meant something, and someone wanted it." Mark ran a hand through his hair, pacing nervously. "But why? It's just a piece of jewelry." "Maybe it's more than that," Samantha said. "If Evelyn's spirit is still here, it's because she's not at peace. She wants us to figure out who did this." Jake groaned, sinking into a chair. "So now we're detectives for a ghost? This just keeps getting better." "She came to me," I said firmly. "She showed me for a reason. We can't ignore it." Leah placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Then we figure it out. If she wants justice, we'll help her get it." The next morning, we split into pairs and began our search for clues. Samantha and Mark headed into town to comb through old records and archives, hoping to find information about Evelyn's death. Leah, Jake, and I stayed at the cabin to search for anything that might have been left behind. Something that could reveal who was with Evelyn the night she died. We started in the boathouse, a rickety structure on the edge of the lake. The air inside was damp and heavy with the smell of mildew, and the floor creaked ominously under our weight. "Does anyone else think this place looks like it hasn't been touched in decades?" Jake asked, poking at a rotting life jacket. "It probably hasn't," Leah replied, rifling through a stack of old logs. "This cabin was abandoned for years before the current owner fixed it up." I was drawn to a corner of the boathouse where a pile of dusty tarps covered what looked like a small chest. I pulled them aside, revealing a wooden box with rusted hinges. "What's that?" Leah asked, joining me. "Let's find out," I said, prying it open. Inside were a collection of water-stained papers, a few faded photographs, and a leather-bound journal. "This must have belonged to someone who lived here before," Leah said, carefully picking up one of the photographs. The image was faded, but it clearly showed a young woman standing by the lake. She wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and around her neck was a locket identical to the one I had found. "That's her," I whispered, my stomach twisting. Leah nodded. It has to be. I opened the journal, the pages brittle under my fingers. The handwriting was neat but faded, and it didn't take long to confirm my suspicions. It was Evelyn's. The entries started innocuously enough, detailing her days by the lake, her love for the water, and the isolation she often felt. But as I read further, the tone changed. Evelyn began mentioning someone, a man whose name she never wrote. She described their secret meetings by the lake, the way he would bring her flowers and promise her the world. But as the entries continued, her tone grew fearful. She wrote about arguments, his temper, and her growing unease. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. I know too much. He's afraid I'll tell someone. If anything happens to me, it's because of him. Please, if someone finds this, tell them I didn't want to die. I looked up at Leah, who had gone pale. She knew she was in danger. Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, frowned. So who's he? We don't even have a name. Not yet, I said, closing the journal. But we will. When Samantha and Mark returned, they brought with them a stack of old newspapers and a grim expression. Did you find anything? Leah asked. Mark nodded, spreading the papers out on the table. Evelyn's disappearance was big news at the time. She was well known in the area, came from a prominent family. But the case was closed as an accident. No evidence of foul play. What about suspects? I asked. There weren't any, Samantha said, frowning. But there's something interesting. Evelyn was engaged to a man named Charles Harper. His family owned the land around the lake. Engaged? Leah asked, looking at me. I nodded slowly, remembering the journal. She didn't write his name, but she mentioned someone. Their relationship wasn't good. Maybe he's our guy, Jake said. Maybe, Samantha said. But we need more than a hunch. If Charles was involved, there has to be something linking him to her death. That night, as we pored over the journal and newspapers, the lake began to hum again. The sound was louder this time, more insistent, and I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. I think she's trying to show us something, I said, standing. Ryan, wait, Leah said, grabbing my arm. I have to, I said, meeting her worried gaze. She's counting on us. Reluctantly, Leah, Samantha, Mark, and Jake followed me to the shore. The lake was alive with movement, ripples spreading outward from its center. What now? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped forward, the cold water lapping at my ankles. Evelyn, I called out, we know the truth. Show us what to do. The water churned violently, and a single ghostly figure emerged from the depths. Evelyn's translucent form hovered before us, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. Her lips moved, forming a single word that sent a chill down my spine. Justice. Evelyn's spectral form lingered at the water's edge, her translucent features alight with sorrow and fury. Her whispered demand for justice hung in the air like a shroud. What do you want us to do? I asked, my voice trembling. Her pale hand gestured toward the boathouse, the motion slow and deliberate. Then, as quickly as she appeared, she dissolved into the mist rising from the lake, leaving us alone with the hum of the water and our racing hearts. We need to check the boathouse again, I said. Leah hesitated, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. She's leading us somewhere. We have to follow this through. Jake muttered something under his breath, but followed as the five of us made our way back to the rickety structure. Inside, the boathouse felt even more oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened with tension. I moved toward the chest where we had found the journal, my flashlight sweeping across the floorboards. Wait, Mark said suddenly. pointing at the far corner. "Do you see that?" The light revealed an uneven patch of the wooden planks, as though something had been hastily repaired. Samantha knelt, running her hand over the boards. "This doesn't match the rest of the floor. It's newer. Let's see what's under it," I said, grabbing a nearby crowbar. With some effort, we pried the boards loose, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a metal box, rusted and covered in dust. I opened it cautiously, the contents sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. Inside were photographs, Evelyn with a man I assumed was Charles Harper. They looked happy in some, but in others the tension was palpable. There were letters too, their contents revealing an increasingly volatile relationship. But the most damning item was a blood-stained scarf. This is evidence," Samantha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone hid it here." "Who?" Leah asked, her eyes wide. "Charles," I said firmly. "It has to be him." Evelyn mentioned in her journal that he was afraid of what she knew. This proves he had something to hide. "But why leave it here?" Jake asked, his skepticism creeping back. "Maybe he thought no one would ever look," Mark suggested. "Or maybe the lake wouldn't let him leave," Leah finished, her voice trembling. We brought the box back to the cabin, laying its contents out on the table. Each piece felt like a puzzle fragment, slowly forming a picture of Evelyn's final days. "What do we do with this?" Samantha asked. "We go to the police," Mark said. "This is enough to reopen the case." "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "What do you mean, no?" Jake asked, glaring at me. "It's not enough," I said. "Evelyn doesn't just want the truth. She wants justice. And that means confronting Charles directly. You want to accuse a man of murder based on the word of a ghost?" Jake scoffed. "She showed me," I said firmly. "I saw what happened to her. If we don't do this, no one will." We found Charles Harper's address in the old newspapers. He still lived in the town, a recluse in a sprawling estate on the outskirts. The drive there was tense, the weight of what we were about to do pressing heavily on all of us. The mansion was imposing, its grandeur faded by years of neglect. As we approached the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I knocked, the sound echoing through the stillness. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing an older man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cold. "We need to talk about Evelyn," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. His expression darkened instantly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Leah said, stepping forward. "We know what you did to her, and we have proof." His eyes flicked to the box in my hands, his composure faltering for the briefest moment. "You don't know anything," he said, his voice rising. "She was unstable, always making threats. She drowned herself, and that's the end of it." "No," I said firmly, stepping closer. "She didn't. You killed her because she knew something about you, something you couldn't let anyone else find out." Charles backed away, his hands trembling. "You have no idea what you're talking about." The air in the room grew cold, and a soft, familiar hum filled the space. Charles froze, his eyes darting around in fear. "She's here," Samantha whispered, clutching my arm. The hum grew louder, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, scattering papers and rattling furniture. A ghostly figure materialized behind Charles. Evelyn, her eyes burning with anger. "No, no!" Charles shouted, stumbling backward. "Stay away from me!" Evelyn reached out, her translucent hand passing through his chest. Charles gasped, his face contorting in pain as memories flooded his mind. "She's making him see it," Leah whispered. "She's showing him what he did to her." Charles collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I didn't mean to. I was scared. She was going to ruin everything." The room fell silent as Evelyn stepped back, her gaze softening. She turned to me, a faint smile on her lips, before dissolving into the air. We called the police, leaving the box and Charles's confession in their hands. As we drove away from the mansion, the weight on my chest lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Evelyn had her justice. Back at the cabin, the lake was still, its surface glistening in the moonlight. I stood on the shore, staring into its depths, and for the first time, it felt truly silent. "Goodbye, Evelyn," I whispered, and for the first time, the lake whispered nothing back. Story 4. It was the summer after graduation, and I found myself wandering the edge of the forest, my feet crunching softly in the dry, autumn-like leaves. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the uneven ground, and I was reminded of all the things I thought I'd left behind, things I didn't want to face. The world had felt so different that morning. My phone had buzzed relentlessly, but when I saw the strange number, I just ignored it. Who was calling at this hour? Anyway, by the time the second call came through, I was standing outside, trying to enjoy the fading warmth of the sun as if it would last forever. The number was the same, but this time there was a message, a cryptic text that made my stomach tighten. "We've set it up. Be at the old camping grounds at midnight. The shadows will guide you." It was signed S, and that was all. I felt a strange unease gnawing at me, but curiosity had always been my weakness. So, with an uncertain heart and a mind brimming with questions, I did what any foolish person would do. I went. The camping grounds were isolated, forgotten by most, with nothing but trees, wildlife, and the distant sound of the river cutting through the landscape. It was a place I had visited often as a kid, where the woods felt like a secret world, where anything could happen. But tonight, it felt different, darker somehow, as though it had been waiting for me. By the time I arrived, the forest was shrouded in twilight, and I stood at the edge of a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large tent, its fabric an unnatural shade of black, almost as if it were absorbing the surrounding light. The air was still, save for the rustling of the trees, which seemed to whisper something just beyond the reach of my hearing. The tent was unlike any I had seen before. The edges were frayed, and it looked old, disturbingly so, like it had been here for decades, though I knew I had never seen it in all the years I had spent in these woods. I took a hesitant step forward. The path was littered with fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. The only sound was the beating of my heart in my ears as I moved closer. As I reached the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but there was no one in sight, no sign of life, just the darkening shadows around me. The flap of the tent stirred slightly in the wind, and I caught a glimpse of something inside, something flickering like a light, but I couldn't make it out clearly. My breath hitched, but I stepped forward, determined. I reached out to lift the flap, but before I could, a voice spoke behind me. "Don't go in." I spun around, startled. Standing in the shadows of the trees was a figure, tall, cloaked in black. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the evening light. But no, there was someone there. I started, but the figure lifted a hand, silencing me. "You should leave while you still can." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight of truth that made my blood run cold. "It's not what you think. The tent calls, yes, but it will take more than you're willing to give." The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I couldn't tear my eyes from the stranger, and for some inexplicable reason, I took a step back, my hand hovering over the flap of the tent. "I don't know who you are," I said, trying to steady my voice, "but I need to see what's inside. I've been invited." The figure's eyes seemed to glimmer in the dark, and then, after a long pause, he said, "I was invited once too. Now I can't leave." That was the moment I should have turned around. That was the moment I should have run. But instead, I took a breath, pushed aside my fear, and lifted the flap. Stepping into the tent felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The inside was far bigger than I had imagined, stretching out like an endless cavern. The light I had seen flickering earlier was coming from a set of candles arranged in a circle in the center of the tent. They burned with an eerie, greenish glow, but it wasn't just the light that felt off. It was the air itself, thick and stagnant, like time had stopped inside this place. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the soft ground beneath me. It wasn't dirt or grass, but something like fabric, smooth, taut, and unnerving. I hesitated, taking in my surroundings. The walls of the tent seemed to warp and shift, the fabric stretching and twisting as if alive. And though the air was heavy, it was also charged, like static electricity, prickling my skin. There, in the center of the tent, was a small wooden box, placed on an old, ornate pedestal. The box was open, revealing something inside, but I couldn't bring myself to approach it just yet. The air seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to look away, to step back. But something pulled at me, a dark, magnetic force that urged me forward. As I reached the box, I saw what was inside. A single key, old and wrought with strange symbols. It looked ancient, almost otherworldly, its surface etched with runes I didn't recognize. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. The moment I touched it, the world around me seemed to shift. The tent grew darker, and the candles flickered violently. A loud, echoing sound filled the space, like something was screaming in the distance, far away but getting closer. I jerked my hand back from the key, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped abruptly, and the tent seemed to settle once more. But something had changed. I could feel it. The air was denser, thicker, as though the very fabric of reality was bending around me. I looked at the key in my hand and felt my mind blur with confusion and fear. What had I just done? A voice echoed from the shadows, soft yet unmistakable. "You've made your choice." I whipped around, but the figure from outside was gone. There was no one left in the tent but me. Then, from somewhere deep within the tent, I saw movement. Shadows swirling, stretching out toward me. They weren't just shadows. They were shapes, forms, indistinct but definitely moving toward me. Panic surged through me as I backed away from the pedestal, clutching the key tightly in my hand. "Leave," a voice whispered, barely audible. "Or stay and face the consequences." The shadows closed in around me, their movement fluid and unnerving, like something alive, something waiting. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back toward the tent's exit, clutching the key tighter in my fist, as though its cold metal might protect me. But no matter how quickly I moved, the shadows seemed to follow, always just out of reach, but closing in, their tendrils stretching toward me like fingers yearning to drag me into the abyss. I finally turned and bolted for the flap. My heart pounded in my chest as I tore through the tent's entrance and into the night air, the cold biting at my exposed skin. The forest felt eerily silent now, the hum of the tent and the strange whispers vanishing as I stepped outside. I stumbled into the clearing, disoriented, still feeling the weight of the key in my hand. My breath came in ragged gasps as I glanced back at the tent. For a moment, it looked completely ordinary again. Just a shadow in the moonlight, silent and still. But I knew better. Something had changed. Something had been set into motion. I took a few unsteady steps away from the clearing, trying to collect my thoughts. But the eerie feeling still clung to me. My eyes darted toward the trees, half expecting something to jump out at me from the darkness. But there was nothing, no movement, no figure, just the overwhelming silence of the forest. As I stood there, my mind racing, I suddenly heard the sound of footsteps behind me. My pulse quickened. Slowly, I turned. Standing there in the shadows was the figure from before, the cloaked man. He was watching me, his expression hidden beneath the folds of his hood. "You shouldn't have taken it," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down my spine. "What is this? What have I done?" "You've opened the door," he said quietly, stepping closer, the sound of his boots crunching on the forest floor. "Now you have to deal with the consequences." I looked down at the key, still clenched in my fist. The key! It was inside the box. "Why? Not everything is meant to be opened," he replied, his voice laced with regret. "That key unlocks more than just the tent. It opens the doorway to the shadows, to the things that lie hidden in the dark corners of this world. And once the door is open, it can never be closed again." I felt a wave of panic rise in me. What do I do now? How do I fix this? The man's gaze softened for a moment, as though he was considering telling me something that might help. But then his expression hardened again. "You've already chosen. Now you must walk the path. The tent is waiting. The shadows will follow you until you finish what you've started." Before I could ask anything more, he turned and melted into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. I stood alone in the clearing, the key heavy in my hand, its weight a constant reminder of the terrible decision I had just made. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. The image of the key and the shadows haunted my every thought. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare, that I could leave the tent behind, forget about it, and move on with my life. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. The following morning, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest again, staring at the spot where the tent had been. It was gone. The clearing was empty, and all that remained was the faint impression of disturbed earth, as though something had recently been there but had moved on. I couldn't explain what I had felt the night before. The cold, the shadows, the pressure in the air. None of it made sense. But I couldn't deny what I had seen, what I had felt. The tent was real, and so were the shadows. As I walked deeper into the woods, my mind kept returning to the mysterious figure and his warning. I had opened a door, and now I had to deal with the consequences. I wasn't sure what the next step was, but I knew I had to return to the place where it all started. The tent, the key, the shadows, they were all connected. I didn't want to go back, but something inside me pushed me forward. Something dark, something that wouldn't let me escape. The forest felt different the second time I entered it, darker, heavier, as though the trees themselves were watching me. The path seemed unfamiliar, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic, and no matter how hard I tried to navigate it, I found myself growing deeper into the woods. Time seemed distorted here, as if I had walked for hours, yet the sun barely moved in the sky. The forest felt timeless, ancient, as though it existed outside of the normal rules of the world. At one point, I thought I heard whispers in the wind, the same low hum I had heard the night before, but now it was louder, more insistent. My mind raced. Was it the forest itself speaking, or was it something else? I stumbled across a small clearing, my heart racing. In the center, partially hidden beneath a canopy of overgrown branches, was another tent. It was different from the one I had seen before, smaller, older, and more weathered. Its fabric was torn in places, the edges fraying and decaying as though it had been there for decades. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I approached. The air grew colder as I drew closer, and the shadows around me deepened. I could feel the pull again, a compulsion to enter, to see what lay inside. But I hesitated. The figure's words echoed in my mind. "You've made your choice." What would happen if I stepped inside? What was waiting for me on the other side of that doorway? I took a step forward, my pulse quickening. The shadows seemed to stir around me, and I knew that whatever I did next would determine the course of my fate. The choice was mine. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind torn between the need to understand and the growing sense of fear that clung to me like a second skin. The shadows were thicker now, swirling around the edges of the tent as if they were alive, and the pull toward it was undeniable. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something primal, as though the very fabric of the forest itself was calling to me. I took another step forward, the dry leaves crunching beneath my boots. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, following my movement, wrapping around me like an invisible force. The tent loomed ahead, its tattered fabric swaying in the breeze. I reached out and touched it, the coldness of the material sending a shiver up my spine. Felt wrong, unnatural. I lifted the flap of the tent slowly, almost reverently. The interior was as dark as night, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move. Just a flicker, a shadow shifting in the far corner. But then it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I hesitated again, but I couldn't turn away. My hand trembled as I stepped inside. The air in the tent was thick with an oppressive silence. It felt as though the very air itself was holding its breath, waiting. I could hear the faintest rustling sound, like whispers, but when I turned to look, there was nothing, just the shadows, and the key that still clung to my hand, its cold metal pressing into my palm as though it were a reminder of my past decision. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step deeper into the tent. It was smaller than the first one, almost claustrophobic, but somehow more suffocating. The walls of the tent seemed to press in on me, the air growing colder, heavier. I could feel something shifting in the dark, something watching me, but I couldn't see it. Whatever was there, it wasn't willing to reveal itself just yet. I walked toward the center of the tent, where I saw a wooden pedestal, similar to the one I had seen in the first tent. And on it was another box. This one was smaller, more delicate, carved with intricate designs I couldn't comprehend. A strange, magnetic pull tugged at me, urging me to open it. I fought the urge for a moment, but it was no use. The key in my hand seemed to thrum with power, as if it knew what needed to be done. With a shaky breath, I inserted the key into the lock of the box. The moment it clicked open, the air around me grew even colder, and the shadows in the corners of the tent began to writhe more violently. My heart raced in my chest as I lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing, just a single, perfectly smooth stone, black as night, sitting on a velvet cushion. I reached for it, and the instant my fingers brushed its surface, the shadows erupted. They shot toward me like a wave, overwhelming everything. The world spun as if I were falling, plunging into an abyss. The cold enveloped me, and I could feel my breath catching in my throat. The darkness surrounded me, and I was drowning in it. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the tent anymore. The landscape before me was unfamiliar, alien. The sky was pitch black, with no stars, and the ground beneath me was a strange, smooth surface, like polished stone. There were no trees, no grass, no sounds. It was as if I had been transported to another world altogether. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented, my heart racing in my chest. The key was still in my hand, its cold metal reassuring me that this was real, or at least as real as anything could be here. I looked around, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but there was nothing to hold on to. No reference, no landmarks. A low, whispering sound filled the air, growing louder with every passing moment. The shadows, the same ones that had followed me in the tent, seemed to swirl around me, gathering in the distance. I could hear them now, voices, quiet, indistinct at first, but then clearer, more urgent. The voices of people, no, of things, crying out in a language I couldn't understand. I wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to turn and flee, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The shadows were drawing closer, swirling around me like a storm. I could see figures now, moving in the darkness, their forms indistinct, like silhouettes in a fog. But one thing was certain, they were watching me. I took a hesitant step forward, my mind spinning, but the instant I did, I felt the ground beneath me tremble, a rumble deep in the earth, as if the very world was shifting. The air grew heavier, and I could taste the bitterness of the shadows in my mouth. Then, from the distance, a figure emerged, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the blackness. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, its eyes fixed on me, studying me. "You've come?" a voice said, low and resonant, like the echo of thunder. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "What is this place? Where am I?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it took a step forward, its movement fluid, unervingly graceful. As it approached, I saw its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. It was human, but not. A strange sense of familiarity swept over me, like I had seen this figure before, in another time, another place. "You've unlocked it," the figure said, its voice like a whisper in the wind. "You've opened the door to this world. Now you must face the consequences." My pulse quickened as the reality of what I had done hit me all at once. The key, the shadows, the tent. I had been tricked into coming here, but there was no going back now. The figure smiled, its lips stretching unnaturally wide. "It's too late to turn back. You are here to stay." The ground beneath me shifted again, and the shadows surged forward, swallowing the world around me. I woke up back in the tent. At least I thought I had. The feeling in the air was different now. Darker, more oppressive. The shadows seemed to hang heavier around me, their presence more invasive, more real. I was on my knees, the key still clenched tightly in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that something had changed. The whispers I had heard earlier were louder now, and they felt closer. They weren't just in the air. They were inside my mind. The voices were speaking directly to me, their words fragmented, incomprehensible. But underneath it all, I could hear one thing clearly. You cannot escape. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, as if they no longer had the strength to hold me. The shadows seemed to crawl along the walls of the tent, reaching toward me, wrapping around me like chains. I reached out, trying to break free, but the shadows held me fast, dragging me back toward the center of the tent. The wooden box was still there, but it had changed. The lid was shut now, and there was a new symbol etched into the surface, glowing faintly with an eerie, red light. The key pulsed in my hand. The shadows felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, as though the very fabric of the air was being compressed, squeezing the life from me. My fingers, still clutching the cold metal of the key, seemed to hum with a strange energy, a force I couldn't explain. It was as though the key had become a part of me, its power thrumming through my veins, its dark influence entwining itself deeper into my soul. I looked down at the box in the center of the tent. The symbol carved into it seemed to pulse with a red, glowing light that made my stomach churn. It felt wrong, too wrong, but at the same time there was an undeniable pull, a compulsion to open it, to find out what it held inside. My hands shook as I reached toward the box, but before I could touch it, the whispers grew louder. They were all around me now, as though the very walls of the tent had come alive with voices. I tried to block them out, but their words wormed their way into my mind, each sentence more frantic than the last. You can't undo it. You can't stop it. The door is open. There's no way back. You will never escape. The whispers swirled around me, overwhelming me. My vision blurred, and I felt as if the shadows themselves were crawling under my skin, tightening their grip. I felt as though I were suffocating, as though the world was shrinking around me, until there was nothing left but the oppressive weight of the tent, the hum of the key, and the suffocating presence of the shadows. My hand, almost of its own accord, hovered over the box. The symbol on its surface seemed to pulse more intensely, as though it were alive, and the whispers grew louder, urging me to open it. Open it, they seemed to chant. It's the only way. My fingers finally brushed the surface of the box, and the moment I touched it, the world around me seemed to shudder. The shadows recoiled for a brief moment, as though they were afraid of the box, and then rushed toward me in a violent surge. The ground beneath me cracked, splitting wide open, revealing an abyss that seemed to stretch into eternity. I fell to my knees, clutching the key tighter. My chest heaved as I tried to breathe, but the air was thick, suffocating. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside my mind, inside my very thoughts, shouting, pleading, demanding that I open the box. Couldn't resist. My fingers found the latch, and with a final, desperate motion, I opened the box. The lid creaked open, and everything around me froze. The shadows stopped moving, the whispers ceased, and for a single, agonizing moment, there was silence. An unnatural stillness that felt as though the world itself had held its breath. Inside the box was nothing but darkness, pure and impenetrable. It wasn't a substance. It wasn't a thing. It was just nothing. An emptiness that seemed to swallow the light that defied all understanding. And in the center of that nothingness, I could make out a faint shape, a figure. It was barely discernible, like a faint silhouette against the black void, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. A voice broke the silence, one that I knew all too well. "You have opened it," the figure said, its voice low and familiar. "The door is now fully open, and you are mine." I staggered backward, my heart racing in my chest. The voice, it was my own voice, but not mine. It was as though it came from deep inside me, from the very core of my being, a voice that had been buried and forgotten, waiting to emerge. The figure in the box began to take form, coalescing from the nothingness into something more solid, more real. It was me, or rather, it looked like me, but it wasn't. This version of myself had hollow eyes, and its skin was ashen, drained of color. Its face was twisted, contorted into a grotesque smile. The thing in the box wasn't me. It was an imitation, a shadow, a reflection of something dark inside of me, something I hadn't known existed until now. Stepped forward, and the world around me trembled. The shadows responded to it, swirling eagerly, like hungry creatures, ready to devour anything in their path. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the terrible truth. The box had not just opened a door to another world. It had opened a door inside of me, to the darkness I had kept hidden away. "You can't escape," the thing whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You have let me out. Now you belong to the shadows." I tried to move, but my body felt like it was made of stone. My muscles refused to obey me. The figure reached out, its cold, bony hand brushing against my cheek, sending a shock of icy terror through my entire being. "You belong to the shadows now," it repeated, its smile widening as it spoke. "And you will bring them into the world. The door is open. You can never close it. Not now. Not ever." I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. The thing in front of me leaned in closer, its breath cold against my ear. "The shadows are coming for you, and they will follow you forever." Suddenly, the world around me exploded in darkness. The shadows surged forward, swallowing me whole. The key in my hand burned with an unbearable heat, as though it had become an extension of the darkness itself. I was pulled into the void, lost to the shadows. I woke again, but this time I wasn't in the tent. I wasn't anywhere familiar. I was standing in the middle of a vast, empty void, the ground beneath me stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was still heavy with the weight of something terrible. There was no sky, no stars, only blackness. Nothing but the oppressive sense of being watched. And then I felt it, the presence. The thing in the box, the shadow of myself, had followed me. It was here, lurking in the dark corners of my mind, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was no longer alone. The shadows had come with me, and there was nowhere left to run. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and with every breath I took, the air seemed to grow heavier. It felt as though the void itself was suffocating me, each passing second stretching into an eternity. The presence of the shadow, the thing that resembled me, was everywhere, lurking in the edges of my vision, whispering in my mind. "You cannot escape," it murmured, its voice winding through my thoughts like a poisonous thread. "You belong to me now. You will always belong to me." I clutched the key tightly in my hand, the cold metal sending a shiver through my body. It was the only thing that still felt real in this place, a stark contrast to the suffocating emptiness around me. I tried to focus, tried to push the terror away, but every attempt felt futile. There was no escape. The key had opened the door to this place, and now I was trapped in its grip. I looked around, desperately searching for something, anything, that might give me a clue about where I was or how I could escape. But there was nothing. No ground beneath my feet, no horizon, no light, just endless darkness. Then I felt a tug on my chest. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The key in my hand vibrated, its power resonating through me. The shadows swirled around my feet, pulling me deeper into the abyss. I fought against it, but the darkness was stronger than I was. It felt like a physical force, its tendrils wrapping around my legs, my arms, dragging me toward an unknown fate. I tried to cry out, to scream for help, but no sound left my lips. The only thing that existed in this place was the relentless pull of the shadows. "You're mine?" the voice whispered again, the words crawling under my skin, invading my thoughts. "You opened the door. You invited me in, and now you must pay the price." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of my own helplessness crashing down on me. How had it come to this? I had never meant to unleash anything this horrible. I had only been curious, but now the curiosity had led me to this place. A place where there was no escape, no redemption, only darkness. The figure, the one that mirrored me, appeared before me again. This time it was closer. I could feel its coldness, like a presence that stretched out across the very air itself. I could see its face clearly now. My face, twisted and hollow, a sickening parody of myself. It smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that sent a wave of terror coursing through me. "Do you know why you're here?" it asked, its voice dripping with mockery. "Because you sought the truth, and now the truth has found you." I trembled as the figure stepped closer, the darkness gathering around it like a cloak. The shadows seemed to obey it, moving with a will of their own. And as it reached out, I felt the coldness of its touch, like 1,000 icy needles piercing my skin. "You cannot hide," it whispered. "You opened the door to this world, and now you must face the consequences." I couldn't speak, couldn't even move. It was as though I was bound, trapped in my own body, unable to escape. The shadows tightened around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. "The door is open," the figure continued, its smile widening. "And once it's open, it can never be closed." Time lost all meaning in this place. The shadows grew thicker, the presence of the figure in front of me more suffocating with every passing moment. I felt like I was being drawn into it, my very essence being pulled into the void. My thoughts, my memories, everything I had known, was beginning to dissolve into the darkness, leaving me as nothing more than an empty shell. I tried to fight it. I tried to push back against the shadows, but there was no way out. The key, the thing that had once seemed like my salvation, was now just another burden, its cold weight a constant reminder of the decision I had made. I had opened the door. I had let the darkness in, and now there was no turning back. "You wanted to understand?" the figure taunted, its voice like the wind howling through an empty canyon. "You wanted to know the truth. Well, now you see it. This is the price of curiosity. This is the price of opening doors you don't understand." I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. I was trapped, caught in a web of shadows and whispers. I had no power here. I had no control. The figure's laughter echoed through the void, filling the space with a chilling sound. It was a laugh that seemed to reverberate through my very soul, a reminder of my own folly. I had thought I could control the key, control the shadows. But now I understood the truth. The shadows had always controlled me. "You thought you were in control," the figure continued, "but you were never in control. You were just another lost soul, caught in the darkness, doomed to wander forever." I felt the coldness of its touch again, as it reached out to grab me. Couldn't fight back, couldn't even move. The shadows surrounded me, closing in, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of light, just a flash, a spark of hope. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the endless blackness. And then, just as I was about to surrender to the overwhelming darkness, I felt it, the smallest flicker of resistance. It was a part of me, something deep inside, something that hadn't given up yet. The key in my hand pulsed again, its cold metal vibrating in time with the racing beat of my heart. "You can fight," a voice whispered, barely audible over the cacophony of the shadows. "You can still fight. It's not too late." The voice wasn't the figures. It wasn't the shadows. It was my own voice echoing through the void. And in that moment, I understood. The darkness, the figure, the shadows, they were all parts of me. Pieces of my fear, my regrets, my unresolved pain. I had invited them in, but I didn't have to let them consume me. I had a choice. I clenched the key tightly, the metal digging into my palm, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I focused on the glimmer of light, the flicker of hope. The shadows resisted, pulling at me, dragging me back into the abyss, but I held my ground. "You are not the darkness," the voice urged. "You are the light. You can push it back." And so I did. I pressed the key into my chest, feeling its coldness burn against my skin. The shadows shrieked as the light surged, pushing them back, forcing them to retreat. The figure howled in fury as the darkness around me began to unravel, the black void peeling away like a layer of skin. I opened my eyes. The world around me was bright again, too bright. The shadows had receded, leaving only a faint memory of their presence. The tent was gone, replaced by the forest I had once known. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, and the ground beneath me felt solid once more. I was back, but the key remained in my hand, its cold metal still a reminder of what I had done, of what I had unleashed. The darkness was gone for now, but I knew it wasn't truly gone. It had only been pushed back, and the door I had opened would always be there, waiting. The shadows are always with you. I heard the whisper, faint but clear. You can never escape them. I looked around, my heart heavy with the knowledge that the battle was far from over. The darkness was still out there, and it would come for me again. But for now, I was free. I had made the choice. I had chosen to fight, and I would keep fighting for as long as I could. Story 5. It all began the day I found the cave. I remember the moment clearly, as if it were frozen in time. My boots crunching on the dry earth, the distant hum of the wind, the sun heavy in the sky. It had been an ordinary hike, a simple escape from the noise of the city, the kind of weekend retreat I'd done dozens of times. But there was something different about that day. It was the way the air seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible energy, and how the land around me felt untouched. The terrain was wild and rugged, far off the beaten path where tourists rarely ventured. I'd heard whispers of it, this hidden cave in the hills, from locals in the town nearby, but I never thought I'd come across it. But somehow, as I trekked deeper into the woods, I found myself standing at its entrance. The cave wasn't particularly remarkable at first glance, just a dark, yawning opening in the side of a mountain, framed by a tangle of ivy and overgrowth. But there was something unsettling about it, an undeniable pull. It was like the air itself vibrated with a strange energy, as though the earth itself was calling to me. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than the isolation playing tricks on me. I had been alone for hours, far from the busy roads, and perhaps my mind was simply adjusting to the solitude. But even as I stood at the cave's mouth, the feeling grew stronger. A tug at the back of my mind, a whisper that I couldn't quite make out. I should have turned back. I should have left. But something in me resisted the urge. It was as though the cave itself had reached out to me, beckoning. I took a deep breath, bracing myself. There was no going back now. Stepping into the darkness, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The further I ventured into the cave, the more the outside world seemed to fade away. The light from my flashlight flickered and bounced off the jagged rocks, casting strange, unsettling shadows on the walls. The deeper I went, the more the air grew thick with an oppressive stillness. It was as if the cave had a life of its own, a pulse, a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I had no idea what had driven me to go deeper into the labyrinth of stone. I could feel the pull, the inexplicable urge to move forward. It was a sensation I couldn't ignore. The darkness seemed to swallow me, and every step I took felt like a step further away from everything I knew. My home, my life, my reality. As I ventured further, I began to hear faint sounds, whispers, soft murmurs in the distance, just beyond the range of my hearing. They were like echoes, but they weren't. They seemed intentional. They beckoned me, come closer, follow the sound. You can't leave now. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I realized they were real. I wasn't alone in the cave. And whatever it was, it wanted me to go deeper. My instincts screamed for me to turn back, to retreat, but something stopped me. It was as though the whispers were pulling at my very soul, compelling me forward. The passage began to narrow, forcing me to crouch lower as I made my way through the cave. The further I went, the more I began to notice strange markings on the walls, symbols etched deep into the stone, some of them faded and barely discernible, others more recent. I couldn't make sense of them. They didn't belong to any language I recognized. I ran my fingers along one of the symbols, feeling a chill shoot up my arm as I touched it. A sudden shiver ran through me, like a warning from the depths of the earth itself. I quickly pulled my hand away, my breath quickening as the whispers in the darkness grew louder. "You have found us. We have been waiting." My heart pounded in my chest. The realization hit me like a punch. I was no longer alone in the cave. I had crossed some invisible threshold, one that had been waiting for me. Something ancient, something forgotten, was drawing me deeper. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The passage eventually opened up into a vast chamber. I stood there for a moment, my flashlight trembling in my hands as it illuminated the space around me. The walls were covered in more markings, intricate and detailed, and at the center of the chamber, there was an altar. A stone platform, aged with time, surrounded by a circle of strange symbols. It was then that I saw them, figures. They were shadowed, vague, and indistinct, but they were unmistakable. They hovered in the far corners of the chamber, their forms flickering in and out of existence like phantoms. I felt their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "You shouldn't have come. It's too late now." I could feel the weight of their presence. They surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, but I couldn't move. My legs refused to work. I was frozen in place, caught in their grip. The whispers swelled, their voices growing louder, echoing around the cavernous space. "The offering is ready. You are the one we need." I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice wouldn't come. It was as though the cave itself had stolen it from me. My body was no longer my own. I could feel the pull of the altar, its cold stone beckoning me. The floor beneath me seemed to tremble, as though it were alive. The figures, their faces still obscured, began to chant, their voices rising in an eerie unison. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were preparing for something ancient and inevitable. I was their offering. "You are the key. You are the one who will awaken us." A sharp, jagged pain shot through my chest, and I fell to my knees. The altar was glowing now, its surface radiating with an eerie light. The markings on the walls flared up in response, the symbols shifting, moving like a living thing. Something was happening, something that I couldn't control. The chamber erupted with a blinding light. Couldn't see. I couldn't hear. The shadows of the figures blurred into an indistinct mass of movement as the entire cave seemed to shake with an otherworldly force. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening. I felt something move inside me, an awakening, a stir in the deepest part of my soul. The whispers stopped, but in their place there was something else. Presence, a knowing. It filled the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and all-encompassing. The figures were gone. The altar, once glowing, had returned to a dull, lifeless stone. But the feeling remained. I was no longer the same. The cave had called to me. It had consumed me. And now there was no turning back. The cave no longer felt like a place of refuge or mystery. It had become something else entirely, something that had claimed me. I could feel it in my very bones, a cold, relentless grip that had settled deep within me. The whispers, though silenced for now, still lingered in the corners of my mind. Their voices were faint, but they were always there, like shadows that refused to fade. I stumbled out of the chamber, my legs shaky, as if the earth itself was holding me in place, refusing to let me go. The air felt thicker than it had before, heavy with a sense of foreboding. As I made my way back down the narrow passages, I noticed something strange. The symbols on the walls, once static and unyielding, now seemed to pulse faintly. It was as if they were alive, their energy radiating outwards, syncing with the beat of my heart. The cave had a rhythm, a pulse, and I was now part of it. I could feel the eyes upon me, the unseen watchers. They were waiting, patient, their presence like a weight on my shoulders. I knew that something had been awakened, but I didn't understand what it was or what it wanted from me. The altar, the symbols, the figures in the shadows, they were all connected, but the puzzle pieces remained scattered, slipping through my fingers. As I ventured deeper, I began to hear something else. Footsteps, the unmistakable sound of movement in the dark, though I was alone. The cave had no natural life. There were no creatures here. It was all stone and silence, yet I could hear them. Someone or something was following me. The footsteps echoed off the walls, mirroring my own steps, as though they were a part of me. I turned, expecting to see the shadows, but there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness. But I wasn't alone. I paused, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps had stopped. I was no longer sure if they had ever been real or if they had been a manifestation of my own fear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the dark. The narrow passage I was in seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in with every step I took. I had no sense of time. The sun had disappeared hours ago, and I had no way of knowing how far I had traveled within the cave. It felt like a labyrinth, twisting and winding endlessly, with no end in sight. The further I went, the more the weight of the cave pressed down on me. It was as if the very earth was pushing me inward, forcing me into its depths. The whispers were louder now, louder than they had ever been. I could hear their words more clearly, though they made no sense. They were fragments of sentences, disjointed and broken, as though the cave itself was speaking to me in riddles. You cannot escape the call. It has begun. The awakening is inevitable. You will serve the master. You are the key. The words gnawed at the edges of my sanity. What did they mean? What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? I didn't know. I only knew that I had to keep going. There was something pulling me forward, a force greater than my own will, a destiny that had already been set in motion. I reached a large cavern. The walls stretched up so high that I could not see the ceiling. The light from my flashlight barely touched the surfaces, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and move on their own. At the center of the cavern was a chasm, a massive crevasse that split the earth wide open. I approached it cautiously, the ground trembling slightly beneath my feet. The air was thick with tension. I peered over the edge, and for a moment, I could see nothing but the endless dark below. And then a flicker, a brief glimmer of something moving deep within the chasm. A shadow, large and indistinct, like a living thing. I backed away quickly, my breath catching in my throat. It was too dangerous to approach, too wild, too unknown. I couldn't even comprehend what I had just seen. The master waits. A whisper came, clear as day. It wasn't in my mind anymore. It was in the air around me, as if it were coming from all directions at once. I turned, suddenly aware of a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall, hunched, cloaked in darkness. I could feel its presence without even seeing its face. It was waiting for me, silent and patient, its eyes fixed on mine. And then I realized it wasn't just the cave that had called me here. It had been waiting for me all along. The figure in the shadows moved forward, slow and deliberate, its form coming into sharper focus as it emerged from the dark. It was humanoid, but its proportions were off, twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. It was almost as though its body had been shaped by the very cave itself, elongated limbs, its face obscured by a deep hood of darkness. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other. I was frozen, unable to look away from the figure's empty eyes. I could feel the pull of its presence, strong, undeniable, like gravity drawing me in. "You," the figure began, its voice low and rasping, like stone grinding against stone. "You have come, at last." I wanted to run. I wanted to escape this place, this nightmare, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed by fear, and yet there was something else, something that kept me rooted in place. It was as though my very soul was tethered to the figure, bound by an invisible chain. "You opened the door," the figure continued, its voice growing stronger with each word. "And now you must face the consequences." I didn't understand. I had opened nothing. I had only come to explore, to discover something new. But the figure wasn't interested in my confusion. It was here for something else. Couldn't breathe. My chest tightened with an unshakable sense of doom, as if the air itself was pressing down on me, forcing me to confront a fate I hadn't been ready for. The figure's presence was suffocating. I could feel the ancient power radiating from it, an energy that was as old as the cave itself. "You are the key," it whispered, its voice a breath on my ear. "You have always been the key." The figure stepped closer, and I instinctively backed away. The ground beneath my feet shifted, the walls groaning as if the entire cave was alive. There was a terrible force in motion, an inevitability that I couldn't escape. It reached out and I couldn't move. Its hand, long and spindly, touched my shoulder, and I felt a cold, piercing sensation shoot through me. I screamed, but no sound came out. The darkness around me seemed to pulse, and I could feel the very earth beneath me tremble. "Do not resist," the figure said, its voice echoing in the vast space of the cavern. "This is the way it must be. You are the one who will awaken him." It was then that I realized what had happened. The cave, the symbols, the figures. I had unwittingly stumbled upon an ancient ritual. I had awakened something that had slumbered deep within the earth for millennia. And now the ritual was reaching its final stage. I was the last piece. I had to be. The air grew thick with a palpable energy, the ground beneath me vibrating with an intensity that made my teeth rattle. The figure stepped back, and I felt myself falling to my knees, as though the weight of everything pressing down on me had become too much to bear. "You will awaken him," the figure repeated, its voice now a whisper, just a breath against the back of my neck. "You are the final piece." And then the ground beneath me split wide open. The chasm in the center of the cavern yawned open, and from the depths, something began to rise. It was monstrous. It was vast. A presence older than time, a being born from the very darkness of the earth. Its eyes, countless and unblinking, turned toward me, and I understood. The cave's call had never been about curiosity. It had never been about exploration. It had always been about me. I had opened the door. I had released it, and now I would pay the price. Story 6. I had always thought of myself as someone who didn't believe in superstition or the fantastical. I liked things simple, grounded in the real world. But that night, around the fire, everything changed. It was meant to be a peaceful camping trip, just me and a few friends, far away from the distractions of the city. We set up camp in a secluded forest, one that no one really talked about, mostly because it was so out of the way. The kind of place where, if something did happen, no one would be around to hear it. That's what we wanted. Quiet, isolation, a break from the noise. And for the most part, that's exactly what we got. The first night was crisp and clear, and we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Nothing unusual. It was the kind of night where the stars seemed endless above, and the wind whispered through the trees. I remember thinking that this was the perfect escape, and nothing could spoil it. But then he showed up. I didn't notice him at first. Maybe he'd been standing at the edge of the clearing for longer than I realized. He was just there, standing at the edge of the firelight, watching us without a word. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a joke, maybe some trick to spook me. But then I realized he was too tall, too still, and too silent to be anyone I knew. We didn't speak to him at first. We all just kind of stared. It wasn't normal, the way he stood there, unmoving, just outside the circle of firelight. My friends were frozen too, unsure of what to do. I guess no one had the courage to say anything, and the silence stretched between us, growing thicker. I tried to convince myself it was just a passerby, someone lost in the woods. But as I looked at him more closely, my doubts grew. His clothes weren't the kind of thing you'd wear for a hike, too clean, too well kept. And his face, I couldn't quite make it out, even though the firelight was strong. There was something about it that felt wrong, almost distorted, as if he was deliberately staying out of the light, hiding part of himself from view. Finally, I spoke up. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual, even though my voice shook. Can we help you with something? He didn't respond. Not immediately, at least. Instead, his eyes moved, slowly, from one person to the next, before landing back on me. It felt as if his gaze pierced through me, seeing things I couldn't even comprehend. The air grew colder, and I swear I could hear the wind stop, like the whole forest held its breath. I'm sorry. Did we do something wrong? My friend Mark asked, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. He was usually the one to crack jokes and keep things light, but even he couldn't seem to shake the tension in the air. The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and grating, like something old and unused. No, he said, you didn't do anything wrong. There was a long pause, and just as I thought the situation might ease, he added, but you should be careful. The forest is watching. We all exchanged looks, unsure of how to respond. It didn't make sense, but somehow it felt true. The words hung in the air like a warning, heavy and unspoken, seeping into our bones. Watching? I asked, my curiosity now getting the better of me. Always, he replied simply, before turning on his heel and walking back into the shadows of the trees. I watched him disappear into the darkness, the crackling of the fire filling the void he left behind. For a moment, none of us spoke. We didn't need to. Something had shifted. The fire burned low, its light flickering as the night deepened. The stranger's words lingered in my mind, and I found myself glancing into the trees, half expecting him to appear again. But the longer I sat there, the more my rational mind tried to suppress the growing sense of unease. Mark was the first to break the silence. Did he say the forest is watching? He asked, as if confirming what we had all heard. Yeah, I replied. He did. Well, that's creepy, Mark muttered. He must have been lost or something. Probably just some old hermit. Maybe, I said, but I wasn't convinced. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he watched us. Well, whatever, Mark continued, his usual bravado creeping back into his tone. We're here to have fun, right? Let's not let some weirdo ruin our trip. But as the hours passed and the fire slowly burned out, I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. The air had grown thick, and the darkness around us felt heavier. It was as if the forest itself had become alive, breathing with us, watching us. I tried to push the thoughts aside, but the feeling refused to go away. I woke up in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me. The sound of the wind, the cracking of a branch, or the unsettling silence that had replaced the usual night sounds. I sat up quickly, my heart racing, and looked around. The others were still asleep, their faces soft in the dim moonlight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced toward the edge of the camp, toward the trees, half expecting to see the stranger standing there, just beyond the firelight. Nothing, but as I lay back down, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard something, a soft whisper in the wind. It was a voice, faint but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." I froze, staring into the dark, listening. No one else seemed to hear it. The next morning, we woke to an unsettling quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, birds calling, leaves rustling, were absent. The air felt still, almost unnatural, and I noticed that the ground around our campsite seemed different, almost as if someone had walked through during the night, leaving subtle traces of disturbed earth. "Maybe a bear," Mark suggested as we packed up, trying to lighten the mood. No big deal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a bear. The forest felt wrong, like something was watching us. I glanced toward the trees again, half expecting to see the stranger standing there, just out of sight. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible through the thick foliage. It was too far to make out clearly, but I was certain it was him. The stranger. His face wasn't visible, but I could feel his gaze on me, even from this distance. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, the figure disappeared into the woods, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. The day passed in uneasy silence. We kept moving through the woods, setting up camp farther from the original site. But the weight of that strange encounter lingered in the back of my mind. The forest was silent, almost too silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that someone, or something, was watching us. Mark and the others tried to keep things light, joking about the weirdness of the night before. But I could tell they were all just as unnerved as I was. The tension between us was thick, though no one said anything about it. We avoided the subject of the stranger, but I could feel the unspoken words in the air, the question that no one dared to ask. Who was he? And more importantly, why had he come? By nightfall, we set up camp in a small clearing by a stream. The air was colder than it had been the night before, and the fire seemed to struggle to keep us warm. As the fire crackled, casting shadows on the surrounding trees, I kept glancing into the darkness, half expecting the stranger to appear again. But he didn't. Still, the unease persisted. The forest felt different, as if it were waiting for something. I didn't sleep that night. The sounds of the forest had faded away completely, replaced by an eerie quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig, had me on edge. My friends slept soundly, unaware of the rising tension that gripped me. That's when I heard it again. The whisper, "Leave this place." I sat up, heart racing, eyes wide. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the fire, flickering weakly in the growing dark. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or my imagination, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The voice was real. The next morning, I mentioned the whisper to the others. Mark laughed it off, saying I was probably just hearing things. Emily, on the other hand, seemed unsettled. She was the one who'd always been the most sensitive to things she couldn't explain. She didn't dismiss me entirely. "I've had dreams about this place before," she said quietly, looking over her shoulder as though to make sure no one was listening. "About being watched. Something following me." I stared at her, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy fog. I hadn't told anyone about the whisper I'd heard, but now that Emily had spoken, the fear that had been building inside me began to crack open. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, as if trying to shake off the thoughts. "I don't know. It's just a feeling, like there's something in the woods, watching us." We all fell silent after that, unsure of how to respond. The air was thick with tension, and it was clear that we all felt it now, the presence, the watchfulness. We decided to break camp early and head back toward the main trail, but as we packed up, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. The forest, the woods, the very earth beneath our feet seemed to be pushing us in the wrong direction, like it was guiding us toward something. We had barely made it a few miles when we came across something strange. An old, weathered sign half hidden behind some bushes. It was a faded wooden board with a symbol painted on it. An eye, surrounded by twisting branches. "What the hell is that?" Mark muttered, coming to a stop in front of it. We all looked at it in confusion. There were no words, just the eerie symbol. Emily stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the sign. Her voice was barely audible. "It's a warning. We shouldn't be here." I wasn't sure what she meant, but the more I stared at the sign, the more uneasy I became. Felt wrong. The air had grown still again, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Leave. Now." I spun around, but there was no one there. It was him again, the stranger. He had found us. He had been watching us, and now he was telling us to leave. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill creep over me. The forest felt alive with an unseen force, as if the trees themselves were closing in around us. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned around and began walking back the way we had come, but the trail didn't seem to lead us out. It was as if the forest had changed, the paths no longer familiar. The trees were denser now, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky, blocking out the sun. The ground beneath us felt uneven, as if the earth itself was shifting, moving under our feet. Emily kept looking over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "We're being followed," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't doubt her. I could feel it too. The same feeling of being watched, the same presence that had followed us the night before. It was close now, too close. I tried to push the fear down, but it was impossible. It was all around me. I glanced at Mark and the others, and I could see the fear in their eyes too. We were all aware now. We weren't alone. As night fell, we set up camp again, though I don't know why. Maybe it was out of habit, maybe it was because we were too exhausted to keep going. But the fire didn't feel as warm this time. It flickered and sputtered, as if it were struggling to stay alive. We huddled around it, casting nervous glances toward the trees. None of us spoke. None of us dared. That's when we heard it, a rustle from the woods, the sound of something moving, something watching. I turned to the others, but before I could say anything, the figure emerged from the trees. The stranger. His eyes gleamed in the firelight. "You shouldn't have come back," he said softly, his voice carrying on the wind. "You've been marked." I stood up, heart racing. "What do you mean? What do you want from us?" He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's not what I want," he said. "It's what the forest wants." The air grew thick with tension. The fire seemed to die, and I felt a coldness settle into my bones. The stranger was closer now, too close. "You've awakened something," he whispered. "Now you can't leave." The words hung in the air like a cold mist, and I couldn't shake the sense of dread that gripped my chest. "What do you mean, we can't leave?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempts to stay calm. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back into the shadows, his form becoming just another part of the forest. "The forest has chosen you," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "And when it chooses, there is no escape." I looked to Mark, Emily, and the others for some kind of reassurance, but their faces mirrored my fear. Emily's eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. Mark looked like he was ready to bolt, his body tense, poised to run. But something told me that running wouldn't help. "The forest is alive," the stranger continued, "and it watches, listens. It sees all who enter. And once you've been seen, it's too late." "Why us?" I asked, almost pleading now. "Why are we here?" The stranger smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "The forest doesn't need a reason. It simply is." Before I could say anything else, he vanished again into the trees, leaving us with nothing but the crackling fire and the terrifying silence that enveloped us. We sat in uneasy silence after the stranger disappeared. The fire flickered in front of us, casting long shadows, and the woods around us felt like an encroaching presence. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, like a living thing. "We need to go," Emily said, breaking the silence. Her voice was raw, filled with fear. "We need to leave now before it's too late." Mark nodded quickly, his usual bravado gone. "Yeah, I'm with you. Let's get out of here." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. It wasn't just the stranger. There was something else, something deeper, something ancient, hiding in the woods, watching us. "We can't just leave like this," I said, my voice almost hollow. "The way out isn't clear anymore. The paths, they're not the same. We have to try," Emily insisted, her eyes wide with panic. "There has to be a way out." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her hand and run into the night, back to the safety of the world outside. But the forest had already marked us. I could feel it now, its presence heavy and suffocating. The trees themselves felt like walls, closing in on us, and every rustle of leaves seemed to be an echo, a warning. The stranger said we've awakened something. I murmured half to myself, what if we can't leave? What if the forest is already taking us? The more I thought about it, the more the stranger's words seemed to sink in. We were trapped here somehow. The forest had seen us, and now, like all the others before us, we were part of its story, part of its endless watch. I glanced into the trees again, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The stillness was unbearable. Not a single leaf stirred. Not a sound came from the woods. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just beyond my sight. "Do you hear that?" Mark asked suddenly, his eyes wide with a sudden realization. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, I couldn't hear anything, but then it came. Faint whispers, soft but insistent, drifting through the wind. They were coming from the trees, from all around us, as if the very forest itself were speaking. It was unintelligible at first, but as the words began to form in my mind, I recognized the language. The voices were calling us, beckoning us forward, pulling us deeper into the woods. "Come closer. You are ours now." The voices were relentless, growing louder, more insistent, until they filled my head completely, drowning out all other thoughts. I grabbed Mark's arm, shaking him. "Do you hear it?" He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, what is that?" "It's the forest," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not just watching us, it's controlling us. It wants us to come closer." The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. As we all stood in the circle of dim firelight, unsure of what to do, the voices were relentless now, pulling at the edges of our sanity, beckoning us into the unknown. "We can't stay here," Emily said urgently, her face twisted with fear. "We need to get out. We need to leave now." I looked at her, at Mark, at the others, and knew deep down that running was pointless. The forest had us, whether we liked it or not. It had already marked us, and the more we resisted, the more it would push back. But the idea of walking deeper into the woods was terrifying. What if we couldn't find our way out? What if we didn't make it back? What if... "We have no choice," I said, finally breaking the silence. "We have to move forward. We have to find a way out before it's too late." Mark nodded reluctantly, though he looked like he might be sick. "Let's just do this, then. Stick together. We'll make it." We packed up what little we had left. The fire already burned down to embers, and took our first hesitant steps into the dark forest. As we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting and writhing like they were alive. Every step we took felt heavier, the ground soft and uneven beneath our feet. I could feel the eyes of the forest on us, watching, waiting. "I feel like we're being pulled in," Emily said, her voice strained. "It's like it wants us to stay." "It's not just that," I said. "The forest, it's feeding off us. Our fear, our uncertainty. The more we resist, the stronger it gets." Mark shuddered beside me. "So what are we supposed to do? How do we get out of here?" "We need to stay together," I said, but even I wasn't sure what that would do. The deeper we went, the more I felt like we were being drawn into something far older and more dangerous than anything we could understand. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time had lost all meaning in the thick, suffocating woods. We had no sense of direction anymore. Every turn we made seemed to lead us back to the same place, to the same twisted trees, to the same overwhelming sense of being watched. And then we saw it. Clearing. At first, I thought it was just another illusion, another trick of the forest. But as we stepped forward, the air seemed to grow clearer, fresher, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw the sky again, the stars. But something was wrong. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit stone structure, a crumbling shrine of some sort, overgrown with vines. And standing in front of it, illuminated by the pale light of the moon, was the stranger. He was waiting for us. We stopped in our tracks, unsure of what to do. The stranger didn't move, but his eyes met mine, as though expecting something. The silence between us was heavy, charged with an unknown tension. "You've come," he said softly, his voice carrying a sense of finality. "You've reached the heart of the forest. What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it all began," he replied, his eyes gleaming in the dark. "The heart of the forest, the place where it claims what is its own." "What do you mean?" I asked again, my heart racing. "The forest is not just a place," he said. "It's a being. It feeds on fear, on despair. And now, it's feeding on you." I knew what was happening now. We weren't just lost. We weren't just being watched. The forest had chosen us as its latest victims, and there was no escape. The air was thick with tension as the stranger spoke. His words echoed in the clearing, carrying an ancient weight that pressed down on us. We stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, as the forest seemed to hold its breath around us. "The forest demands a price," he said, his voice soft but unyielding. Those who enter, those who awaken its hunger, they must offer something in return. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. My throat tightened as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. What kind of price? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The forest takes what it wants, he said, his eyes narrowing. It demands a life, a sacrifice. I looked around at my friends, their faces pale and drawn. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for Mark, and Mark himself was barely holding it together. We had all heard the stories, but none of us had imagined that something like this could actually be real. You mean one of us? Emily's voice cracked. One of us has to die? The stranger didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured to the shrine behind him. The ancient stones cracked and weathered by time. The ritual must be performed. A soul must be given to appease the forest. Only then will it let you go. I could feel the ground beneath me pulse, as though the earth itself was alive. The trees around us seemed to shift, the shadows stretching longer, wrapping themselves tighter around us. We can't do this, I said, my voice rising in desperation. We can't just offer one of us to this thing. The stranger's expression didn't change. The forest doesn't care about your morals. It only cares about its hunger. The price must be paid. For a moment, we were all silent, the weight of his words sinking in. The fire that had once felt like a warm shield now seemed like a distant flicker of light, unable to protect us from the darkness that was closing in. Emily stepped forward, her voice shaking. I won't let it take anyone. We can't just stand here and let it decide for us. Mark nodded in agreement. We fight back. We don't give in. But even as he said the words, I knew it was futile. The forest was too powerful. The pull, the hunger was too strong. It had been watching us, waiting for us to get too far in. And now it was going to claim what it was owed. It happened quickly. The stranger didn't need to say another word. The trees began to stir, the wind picking up, and the shadows around us twisted and lengthened, as though the very forest itself was reaching for us. The ground beneath us rumbled, and I looked down to see the earth cracking open, revealing a dark abyss. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and with it came the overwhelming sense of something ancient and terrible awakening beneath our feet. In that moment, I understood what the stranger had meant. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a force, a being that could not be denied, a hunger that could not be satisfied by anything less than a life. Run! Emily screamed, but it was too late. Before any of us could move, the ground beneath us surged upward, and something black and swirling, reached out for us. It felt like a hand, but it was made of shadows, twisting and stretching to pull us down into the depths. The stranger was no longer standing by the shrine. He was part of the darkness now, his body dissolving into the shadows as if he had never truly been real. But his voice echoed in our ears. The price has been chosen. I don't know how it happened. One moment, we were all huddled together, trying to find a way out, and the next, everything erupted into chaos. The earth shook violently, and the forest screamed. A terrible, piercing sound that made my ears ring and my bones rattle. Mark tried to run, but the ground grabbed him, pulling him toward the abyss that had opened beneath our feet. Emily and I screamed, reaching out for him, but it was too late. The darkness engulfed him, swallowing him whole. Mark! Emily cried, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the forest. The ground surged again, pulling her toward the same fate. Emily! I shouted, but I couldn't move. The force of the forest was too strong, too overpowering. It was pulling me in now, tugging at my body, dragging me toward the blackness that awaited below. The last thing I saw was Emily's face, her eyes wide with terror as the darkness swallowed her whole. And then, there was nothing. When I woke, I was no longer in the clearing. The forest had changed. The trees were twisted, gnarled, and blackened, as if the very life had been drained from them. The air was thick with a suffocating fog, and the ground beneath me was soft, like wet soil. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, sluggish. My limbs refused to obey me. Panic surged within me, but it was muffled by the thick fog, the strange, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to close in from all sides. I heard something in the distance, soft whispers, voices drifting through the fog. At first, they were unintelligible, but as I focused, they began to form into words. You are ours. You will never leave. The forest has claimed you. The words wrapped around me like chains, locking me in place. The forest had done it. It had claimed us, and now I was a part of it. I tried to scream, to fight against the force that was holding me in place, but no sound came. It was as though the forest had stolen my voice, just as it had stolen my friends. Time had no meaning here. I was no longer sure how long I had been trapped in this place. Days? Hours? It didn't matter. The forest had erased time, had erased everything but the endless whispers and the growing sense of despair. The shadow that had taken Mark, that had claimed Emily, still hovered in the background of my mind. I could still hear their voices, faint but present. They were part of the forest now, just as I was. And then, I heard the voice again, the one that had first spoken to us, the one that had warned us to leave. You should never have come. It was then that I understood the true nature of the forest. It wasn't just a place, a force, or even a being. It was a prison for those who dared to trespass, for those who were foolish enough to believe they could escape its grip. The forest had no intention of letting us go. It was never about offering a life, a sacrifice. It was about taking. The forest took everything, your soul, your memories, your very essence, and locked it away in its dark, endless depths. I had become part of the forest now, and no one who entered would ever leave. As the fog continued to swirl around me, I felt the weight of my fate settle in. I had become what I feared most, a shadow in the forest, a part of the watchful, ever-hungry woods. And I knew that, like the others before me, I would never be free. I was the forest now, and the forest was me. The end had come. If you've watched the video till the end, hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon.